It was late September when a group of college friends decided to go camping in the dense forests of northern Michigan. The area was called Ravenwood, a stretch of woodland that locals avoided, especially after dark. Over the years, hikers and hunters had disappeared there, sometimes for hours, sometimes forever, and whispers in the nearby town claimed the forest watched and remembered those who entered. Four friends drove up for a weekend escape. Tyler, the natural leader of the group, Samantha, curious and fearless, Brian, skeptical and practical, and Megan, Tyler's younger cousin who loved photographing nature. They parked at a trailhead, backpacks loaded, spirits high, joking about the eerie stories. Tyler insisted it was all superstition. The forest was breathtaking by daylight. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, the smell of pine and wet earth was intoxicating, and the trees towered like ancient sentinels. They hiked deeper into Ravenwood, laughing, snapping photos, and marking their route. By evening, they reached a clearing with a small stream. Tyler suggested setting up camp there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to die. Samantha noticed it first, a faint rustling like something moving between the trees. "Probably just animals," Brian said, but his voice wavered. As darkness fell, they lit a fire. Shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering as if alive. Megan kept snapping photos, but she noticed something strange. In several pictures, shapes appeared behind them, tall, thin silhouettes with limbs bent at impossible angles. Each time she pointed it out, the shapes were gone when anyone looked directly. Around midnight, Tyler decided to explore a nearby ridge. Against Samantha's warnings, the group followed him, flashlights piercing the blackness. Almost immediately, they realized something was wrong. The forest seemed different. Paths twisted, trees moved, and distant noises, footsteps, whispers, and the faint sound of someone calling their names echoed from all directions. Then came the growl. Low, wet, and inhuman, it circled them. A shadow flickered at the edge of the trees, impossibly tall, thin, and distorted. Tyler stepped forward, but the shadow vanished. Panic set in. They ran, tripping over roots and rocks, branches slapping faces, calling for each other. Back at the clearing, the tent was gone. Their gear was scattered. The fire was out. Their car at the trailhead, now miles away through paths that no longer led anywhere, vanished too. The forest seemed to have swallowed them whole. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Jenna screamed. Samantha and Megan saw her being dragged into the darkness, screaming for help, yet no one could reach her. The shadows moved with deliberate intelligence, guiding them toward a twisted part of the woods filled with strange wooden effigies carved from dark branches, each figure resembling someone they knew. Ethan tried to pull Megan away, but the forest resisted. Roots and vines coiled around their legs. The whispering voices promised safety if they joined. Panic paralyzed them. Each step forward was met with shifting paths and branches that seemed to grasp at them, bending reality itself. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing. A figure stood there, impossibly thin, face blank, eyes glowing red in the faint firelight. The effigies surrounded it, writhing like living things. "You belong here now," it whispered. Screams echoed as Megan vanished into the shadows. Samantha ran, but the forest twisted around her, paths folding in on themselves. Tyler tried to chase her, but he was pulled back, limbs bending unnaturally as he fell into the dirt. The last thing he saw being the red-eyed figure approaching. Morning came, or what seemed like morning. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no evidence of the campers, only the scattered effigies left behind. Locals would later find the campsite abandoned, tents ripped apart, and their camera equipment still running. Every photograph showed shapes that didn't exist in the forest, eyes glowing in the darkness. Years later, hikers would whisper about the campers of Ravenwood, and locals avoided the forest after dusk. Some claimed that if you entered too deeply, you could hear the forest calling your name, and if you answered, you would vanish, added to the tally of shadows that waited, patient and hungry, within Ravenwood's depths. The forest never forgives, it never forgets, and it never lets anyone leave. Story the end. It was late September in Vermont when a group of college friends decided to take a weekend trip into the Green Mountain National Forest. The five of them, Ryan, Kelly, Marcus, Lila, and Nate, were looking for a break from the city, something off the beaten path. They'd heard rumors about an abandoned logging trail deep in the forest, a place locals avoided, though no one could give a clear reason why. Perfect for a weekend adventure, Ryan had said, joking about how haunted it supposedly was. The first day was typical: hiking, snapping photos, teasing each other about who could last longer off the grid. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with tall pines blocking most of the sunlight. Birds flitted through the branches, and the occasional squirrel rustled in the undergrowth. By the second day, they decided to explore the deeper logging trail. The path was narrow, overgrown, and littered with fallen branches. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The forest seemed to swallow sound entirely. The crunch of their boots on the leaves, even their voices, seemed muted. Marcus, the joker of the group, started making noise to lighten the mood. "What, no wolves? No ghosts? This is supposed to be scary," he said, laughing. But the laughter quickly died when Ryan froze and pointed at a shape moving between the trees. "What is that?" Kelly whispered. It was tall, almost impossibly so, hunched, and its movements were too fluid for a human. Its limbs bent in wrong directions, and its head tilted unnaturally, like it was trying to see them from every angle at once. Before they could react, it vanished, leaving only a faint rustle in the underbrush. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Lila suggested turning back, but Ryan insisted they press forward, eager to prove the haunted trail was nothing more than a story. They walked for another hour, the forest growing darker despite the early afternoon sun. The path began to split and twist, and soon they realized they had no sense of direction. Every time they tried to retrace their steps, they ended up back at the same clearing, a small hollow surrounded by twisted trees. It was there that the whispers began. Faint at first, just at the edge of hearing, then clearer. The voices called their names, sometimes individually, sometimes all at once. "Nate, come closer." "Kelly, over here." "Ryan, don't turn around." They froze, trying to convince themselves it was the wind, but the voices were distinct, familiar even. Nate swore he could hear his deceased grandmother calling to him. Kelly began crying, her voice trembling as she shouted for them to leave. Then came the first scream. Lila let out a high-pitched, terrified shriek, and in an instant, she was gone. 1 second she had been there, the next, nothing. No trace, not even a mark on the forest floor. Panic took over. Ryan, Marcus, Kelly, and Nate ran blindly, stumbling through the dense trees, but the forest itself seemed to shift. The paths they had taken no longer existed. Trees leaned inward, creating walls, hiding the sky, warping the landscape around them. Every direction looked the same, and the whispers never stopped. Hours, or maybe minutes, they couldn't tell, passed before they found an old cabin hidden among the trees. Its walls were warped and rotted, windows caked with grime. Desperate, they ran inside and locked the door. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of mold and rot. Scratches ran along the wooden walls, deep gouges that looked fresh. Their flashlights flickered as if struggling against some unseen force. And then the whispers came inside. Louder, closer. Outside, branches tapped against the cabin, soft at first, then with a rhythm, like something large was testing the walls. Then silence, followed by a low, guttural sound. Breathing. Too deep, too heavy, like the forest itself had a throat. They huddled in the corner, terrified, when the door creaked. Not open, just bent, warped inward, as though the wood had grown soft. The shadows stretched, and a figure appeared. Tall, thin, limbs crooked, face pale and elongated. Hollow, dark eyes stared at them, and it tilted its head unnaturally, moving without making a sound. The creature leaned forward, and they heard the voice, not its own, but theirs. Each friend heard their own name whispered back to them in their exact tone. Nate screamed, and the creature mirrored his scream, distorted, unnatural. In a desperate panic, Ryan grabbed a log and struck the door, breaking it free. They ran. Branches clawed at them, roots wrapped around their ankles, and the creature glided behind them, keeping pace effortlessly. By dawn, only Ryan and Marcus made it out. Kelly and Nate had vanished somewhere in the twisted paths, their screams swallowed by the forest. The authorities found no trace of the missing friends despite searching for days. The locals warned them that Crow Hollow never let people leave untouched, and those who survived carried something with them: voices in the dark, glimpses of shadow, nightmares that never ended. Ryan returned home to Detroit, but at night he would wake hearing whispers calling his name. Marcus moved across the country trying to escape the memory, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tall, crooked figure, smiling that unnatural smile, tilting its head, waiting. Crow Hollow remained untouched. Hikers and campers would occasionally vanish, and if you listened closely, locals said you could hear the whispers of the lost, carried by the wind, calling for someone to follow them into the shadows. No one who enters truly leaves, and the forest remembers. It waits. Story the end. The sky had already turned a deep, bruised purple when Alex, his cousin Rachel, and their friends, Ben and Olivia, drove up the winding dirt road toward Ravenwood Forest, a remote woodland in northern Pennsylvania. The forest was notorious among locals, not just for its dense, impenetrable trees, but for the stories. Hikers who disappeared, strange lights at night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The group laughed nervously at the tales, brushing them off as superstition, the kind small towns love to propagate. They parked near an old trailhead marked by a rusted iron sign that read Ravenwood, private property. Alex jumped out first, slamming the car door. Let's get moving. The sun's almost gone. Rachel hesitated. I don't know. It already feels heavy here. Relax, Ben said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. It's just trees. How scary can it be? They followed a narrow path that snaked between massive oaks and pines. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Shadows stretched unnaturally long as the last sunlight filtered through the canopy. With each step, the forest seemed to tighten around them, the trees bending subtly as if leaning in to watch. After a mile, they came across a small creek. Olivia bent down to drink, and as she did, she froze. Did you guys hear that? Alex laughed. It's just water, Oli. No, she said, pointing upstream. There was a rustling, something moving against the current of the forest, deliberate and slow. They all turned their flashlights toward the noise, but nothing moved, just the shadows of trees dancing in the weak beam. The group pressed on. Hours passed, the trail growing less distinct as thick underbrush swallowed the path. Every so often, branches snapped behind them, though no one had stepped that far. The air grew colder, damp and metallic, and an unease settled over them. By nightfall, they found a clearing and set up camp. The firelight flickered, throwing the trees into grotesque shapes. They tried to laugh, telling ghost stories and joking about the forest watching them, but no one really felt the humor. Around midnight, Alex awoke to the sound of soft whispering. He strained to listen. The voices were faint, overlapping, incoherent, and yet unmistakably human. He nudged Rachel. Do you hear that? She sat up, eyes wide. Yes, someone's out there. Ben grabbed a stick from the fire. It's probably an animal. No, Olivia whispered. It sounds like it's inside the forest, watching. The whispers grew louder, forming words, sentences, each voice a distorted mimic of someone they knew, calling their names. They froze when a faint figure appeared between the trees. Tall, thin, limbs too long, movements unnaturally smooth. Its face was obscured by shadow, but the gaze was unmistakable, hungry, patient, unmoving. They ran blindly into the forest, tripping over roots, slipping in mud. Every direction seemed identical, the trees twisted, paths looping back, as if the forest itself were alive, reshaping to trap them. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time had lost meaning. Hunger and thirst gnawed at them. Shadows moved just beyond the flashlight beams, always retreating, always watching. Occasionally they would hear footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, never quick, never chaotic. On the second night they stumbled upon a decrepit cabin, its roof caved in, walls blackened with age. Inside the floorboards creaked ominously. In one corner lay a spiral of bones, small and human-like, arranged with precision. Carved into the wall were words. The forest takes what it wants. Fear overwhelmed them. They fled, but the forest had already begun to change. The trail they had been following vanished. Branches tore at their clothes, roots tripped them, and fog thickened, clinging to the ground and choking the air. By the third night, Rachel was whispering constantly, her eyes darting to every shadow. I saw one, she said. It's following us. They all saw them eventually. Figures emerging from the fog, tall, thin, featureless, some resembling the friends themselves, with faces twisted into smiles that weren't right. The forest seemed to breathe, the whispers a chorus of voices, some their own, some of people long gone. Desperation drove them. They ran until exhaustion claimed them. Olivia collapsed near a fallen log, calling out for help. When Alex returned to her, she was gone. Only her scarf remained, snagged on a branch, the ends fluttering like a flag in a windless night. Ben vanished next. Alex and Rachel pressed forward, their minds fraying. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a voice calling to them. They stumbled into a clearing where the trees arched into unnatural shapes, forming a tunnel. At the far end, faint light flickered, but it was pale, sickly, and seemed to pulse, a heartbeat of the forest itself. Shapes appeared in the fog, dozens of them, all thin, all moving with impossible grace. Rachel froze, pointing. One figure stepped forward. Its face was hers, but wrong. Eyes hollow, lips cracked into a permanent smile. It reached out. Alex grabbed her hand, running blindly. They crashed through the underbrush, but the forest refused to let them go. Every turn brought them back to the same clearing, the same fog, the same hollow whispers. When dawn broke, or what passed for dawn in Ravenwood Forest, their screams were swallowed. Alex never saw Rachel again. The forest claimed them both. Weeks later, hikers found a campsite, long abandoned. Tents shredded, gear scattered. Among the debris, a camera lay face up in the mud. On the screen, the last photo showed 4 smiling friends sitting around a fire. In the shadows behind them, the countless tall, thin figures stood watching. Ravenwood Forest remained, patient and hungry, and those who entered too far were never seen again. Story the end. The sun was already low in the sky when Jason pulled the SUV onto the gravel shoulder at the edge of Devil's Creek Forest. The place was rumored to be cursed, a dense swath of woods stretching for miles in rural West Virginia. Local legends told of hikers vanishing without a trace, hunters disappearing, and strange lights flickering between the trees at night. Jason didn't care. He was a documentary filmmaker chasing real-life horror, and Devil's Creek was the perfect story. With him were his fiancée, Rachel, and their friends Marcus and Ellie. They carried backpacks filled with cameras, tripods, and minimal camping gear. Jason had studied maps, but in reality, he was relying more on instinct and rumor than anything concrete. They hiked the first mile easily, following a barely visible dirt trail that wound through dense pine and oak. The forest was thick and oppressive, sunlight filtering in slivers through the canopy. Birds chirped sporadically, but soon that too faded, leaving an unnatural silence. "I feel like we're being watched," Ellie whispered, tugging her jacket tighter. "Relax," Jason said. "You're imagining it. Forests are quiet sometimes." By late afternoon, they found a clearing beside a small stream. The ground was soft, muddy in patches, and the smell of wet leaves was strong. They set up camp, pitching a tent and starting a small fire. As night fell, the air grew colder and heavier. They ate canned food and shared a few laughs, trying to mask the unease creeping in. Then, from the forest beyond the firelight, came a snapping sound. Twigs breaking underfoot. The 4 of them froze. "Probably a deer," Marcus said. His voice was higher than usual, but the snapping persisted, coming closer, circling the clearing. Ellie shivered, whispering, "That's not a deer." Jason grabbed a flashlight and walked to the edge of the clearing. The beam caught glimpses of tree trunks, branches, and shadows, but nothing solid moved. Then came a scream. Low, guttural, impossibly human, but wrong. The sound echoed, cutting off abruptly. Jason spun around. "Did you hear that?" Rachel nodded, pale. "We need to stay in the tent." The first night passed without further incident, though sleep came fitfully. But by morning, the forest seemed different. The trail they had followed vanished, replaced by a wall of dense undergrowth. Every tree looked the same, gnarled and wet, leaves dripping with condensation. They tried to retrace their steps, but the forest refused to cooperate. Every direction seemed identical. Shadows shifted strangely, always at the edge of vision. Hours later, they stumbled upon a cabin hidden in a grove of dead pines. Its wood was blackened and splintered, windows broken. Jason, eager for footage, pushed open the door. Inside, the air was fetid, smelling of mold and decay. The floorboards were rotted, yet sturdy enough to walk on. The walls were covered with scratches and carvings. Some looked like letters, others like symbols. Among them were tally marks, hundreds of them, scratched deep into the wood. Ellie's eyes widened. "What is this place?" she whispered. Jason moved closer to the wall, camera in hand. He traced the carvings with his finger. One mark was fresh, deep red, as if it had been made with blood. Suddenly, the scratching sound returned, louder this time. Not outside, inside. Something moved above them, across the ceiling beams. They froze. A shadow detached itself from the rafters and dropped silently. Tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long, fingers ending in black claws. Its face was pale, expressionless, eyes black and hollow. It moved with jerky, predatory speed. Jason screamed, raising the camera as if it could protect him. Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Marcus swung a piece of wood, but it passed through the figure like mist. Ellie screamed as the creature lunged at her. Chaos erupted. They ran out of the cabin, stumbling through the undergrowth. The forest had shifted again. Paths vanished, trees warped, roots twisting like grasping hands. Every direction seemed to loop back to the cabin. Night fell. The creature stalked them silently, occasionally flashing into view between the trees. They huddled together near a stream trying to stay quiet, but the forest had other plans. A low, hissing whisper echoed through the woods, calling names in voices they recognized, mocking them, confusing them, drawing them apart. Hours later, Marcus vanished. One moment he was trying to hold Rachel's hand. The next, a scream echoed, then silence. Ellie clutched Jason, tears streaking her face, and Rachel sobbed, praying. By dawn, the forest finally relented, or so it seemed. The trail reappeared. They ran, moving faster than they ever had, branches tearing at their skin. But when they reached the gravel road, the SUV was gone. No tire tracks, no sign it had ever been there. Only trees stretched endlessly and the sound of something moving in the underbrush. Rescue teams found their footprints leading into the forest, but none leading out. Searchers reported hearing faint screams carried on the wind, catching glimpses of shadowy figures between trees, but no trace of the 4 campers was ever found. Locals whispered that Devil's Creek Forest was alive, that it reshaped itself, trapping anyone who entered. Some said it was hungry, feeding on fear. Others said it was a collector, adding its victims to the strange patterns, tally marks, and symbols carved into its heart. Years later, hikers report seeing a cabin deep in the woods. The walls are scratched with numbers and letters, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear whispers calling your name. Those who approach rarely return. The forest waits, always waits. Story the end. It was late August of 2018 when 5 friends from upstate New York, Ryan, Megan, Tyler, Sophie, and Jake, decided to explore the remote Pine Ridge Forest. The forest had a reputation in their small town. Hikers went missing, strange lights appeared at night, and locals refused to go deeper than the first mile of the main trail. Stories of the shadow people that supposedly roamed the woods were whispered in bars and around campfires. The group didn't believe in ghosts, though. They were thrill seekers, drawn to the forest's eerie reputation. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun warm and bright. Ryan, the unofficial leader, insisted they leave the main trail and head toward a spot marked as Old Pine Creek on an outdated topographic map. Megan, cautious by nature, hesitated, warning that straying from marked trails in such a dense forest was dangerous. Tyler and Sophie, both adrenaline junkies, egged Ryan on, while Jake, quiet and observant, simply followed along, noting every subtle change in the forest. The first few hours were ordinary. Birds sang, insects buzzed, and the group laughed as they clambered over roots and rocks. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest grew darker. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor, blocked by the thick canopy. The usual forest sounds faded into silence. By the time they reached the creek, the air had grown unnaturally still. The creek itself was sluggish, its water dark and murky. They set up camp nearby, keeping the fire small to avoid attracting attention from wildlife or whatever else might be in the forest. As night fell, a low wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. Megan shivered, sensing something off, but Ryan laughed it off. Around midnight, Jake woke the group with a shaky whisper. "Did anyone else hear that?" They all froze. From somewhere deep in the forest came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling their camp. It wasn't the crunch of animals. It was heavier, human-like, but there was no answer when they called out. The footsteps stopped when Ryan shined his flashlight toward the tree line, but the oppressive feeling lingered. The first real terror came when Tyler went to relieve himself at the edge of the clearing. Megan heard a scream, sharp and guttural, echoing through the trees. When she and Sophie ran to the sound, Tyler was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground, but there were no tracks, no signs of a struggle, only the faint, unsettling sound of breathing from the darkness. Panic set in. Ryan tried to organize a search, but the forest seemed to warp around them. Trails looped back onto themselves. Landmarks disappeared or moved. The creek that had seemed a simple reference point now twisted in ways that made no sense. Shadows stretched impossibly, folding in on themselves, and the whispering began. Low, distorted voices calling their names, repeating in tones just slightly off, like a cruel mimicry. The night dragged on. Sophie reported seeing a figure watching from the shadows, tall, thin, limbs bent at angles that no human should bend. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated malice. Megan swore she felt cold fingers brushing her shoulder when no one else was near. Ryan tried to remain calm, insisting it was an animal or their imagination. But even he could not shake the feeling that the forest itself was alive, aware of them. By dawn, Tyler was gone, and panic had turned to terror. They packed what they could carry and tried to retrace their steps, but the forest had changed overnight. Every direction seemed wrong. The shadows of the trees moved against the sun, and faint whispering followed them, even in daylight. That evening, they stumbled upon an abandoned ranger cabin hidden deep in a valley. The door creaked open as if expecting them. Inside, the air was thick with rot. The walls were carved with symbols, jagged lines and spirals that made their eyes ache to look at. On the floor lay tattered clothing and bones, some fresh, some decayed. Megan noticed scratches along the wall, spelling words. They are watching, always watching. They didn't linger. But as they tried to leave, the forest seemed to close in. Paths twisted impossibly, leading them in circles. Jake saw shapes moving between the trees, tall, indistinct, humanoid, but vanished when he tried to focus. Night came quickly, and with it the whispering intensified. The figures emerged, slow and deliberate, circling the camp, their presence pressing down on the five of them. One by one, the friends disappeared. Tyler had vanished the first night. Ryan was the next, dragged silently into the shadows while Sophie and Megan huddled together. Jake and Sophie ran blindly, breaking through undergrowth, only to find themselves back at the clearing where they first camped. It was as if the forest refused to let them leave. In the final hours, Sophie and Megan heard voices in their own voices, calling to them from the darkness. Shapes loomed just beyond the light of their small fire, and whispers grew into anguished cries. Then suddenly, everything went silent. They were found 2 days later, wandering along a logging road on the edge of the forest, dazed and screaming incoherently. Authorities searched the area but found no trace of the others, Tyler, Ryan, or Jake. The forest seemed to have erased all evidence of their presence. Sophie and Megan never returned to the forest. Both were haunted by nightmares of the shadowy figures, the whispering voices, and the ever-shifting woods. Some nights, they would wake to find the faint sound of footsteps circling their homes, though no one was there. Locals say Black Hollow, or Pine Ridge as the maps now call it, remains hungry. The woods remember those who enter, twisting paths, hiding landmarks, and summoning shadows to guide the unwary deeper. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint whispers calling from the trees, echoing the names of those who never returned. Story the end. It started with a text from my cousin Ryan, who was always looking for adventure. He'd convinced me to join him and 3 friends, Katie, Mark, and Lisa, on a weekend camping trip in the Wallowa Mountains of northeastern Oregon. Ryan swore it would be off the beaten path, untouched forest, the perfect place to disconnect. We drove up Friday afternoon, the sky gray and overcast. The forest there was dense, the kind of place where sunlight barely touches the ground. Moss coated everything, trees, rocks, even the trail markers that were faded and barely visible. By the time we reached the campsite, the air was damp and heavy with the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. After setting up, we went for a short hike along a narrow trail that Ryan insisted led to a waterfall. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but oppressive, unnatural silence. Birds were absent, insects were gone, and the wind didn't move the treetops. Feels wrong, Katie muttered, keeping her jacket zipped tight. Relax, Ryan said. It's just dense forest. It's normal. I wanted to believe him, but there was a feeling in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing where the waterfall should have been. Instead, there was a deep pool surrounded by thick roots and fallen logs, still as glass. That's when we noticed the footprints. Barefoot, large, human-like, but elongated with unnaturally long toes. They led away from the pool into the trees. Ryan wanted to follow them. I hesitated. Katie and Lisa agreed with me, but Ryan's excitement was infectious. "It's fine, just a short way," he said. We followed the prints for what felt like hours. The forest grew darker and denser. The canopy above blocked the already dimming light, and the underbrush was thick and clawed at our legs. Eventually, we stumbled into a small hollow where an abandoned cabin sat, hidden beneath layers of moss. The cabin smelled of damp wood and something worse, something metallic, iron-like. Inside, the floor was covered in symbols scratched into the wood, tall stick figures with elongated limbs, faceless heads, and a series of small notches along the edges. They were unmistakably human figures, but wrong, twisted in a way that made your stomach tighten. We froze as a whispering began. Soft, indecipherable at first, then repeating our names. Ryan, Lisa, Mark, Emily. Then came the movement outside the cabin, shadows twisting between the trees, shapes taller than any human, thin, with pale skin stretched over elongated bones. Their eyes glimmered black in the dim light. Mark whispered, "We need to leave. Now." We ran. Branches tore at our clothes, roots tripped us, and the forest seemed to close behind us, erasing any trail we thought we'd made. The figures followed silently, always at the edges of our vision. At some point, Lisa vanished. One moment she was screaming, the next, gone. The forest swallowed her. Ryan and I were too terrified to stop, our lungs burning, our legs battered and bleeding. By dawn, I found myself alone at the edge of the forest where the trail should have led to the main road. Ryan was gone. The search teams later found no trace of him, Lisa, or Mark. The footprints, barefoot, elongated, remained near the hollow, leading deeper into the trees, never out. Locals in the nearby town avoid that part of the forest entirely. Hikers tell stories of whispers calling their names, glimpses of pale figures standing among the trees, watching silently. Some say the forest takes people, adding them to the collection of shapes that wander forever, faceless and barefoot, waiting for the next visitor to follow the wrong trail. I've never gone back, but sometimes in my dreams I hear the whispers. I see those long, thin shapes moving just beyond the tree line, and I know that the Wallowa Forest doesn't forget, and it doesn't let go. Story the end. It was a crisp October evening when a group of friends decided to hike in the sprawling forests outside of Ashbury, Vermont. The area was called Ironwood, a dense, old-growth forest thick with pines and oaks. Locals avoided it, especially after dark. Tales of hikers who vanished without a trace were whispered in town, though no one spoke openly about what really happened in Ironwood. The group consisted of 4 college friends: Ryan, adventurous and confident, his girlfriend Claire, cautious but curious, Mike, skeptical and practical, and Jenna, Ryan's younger sister, eager to prove herself on her first overnight hike. They arrived just before sunset, backpacks packed, flashlights ready, joking about the haunted woods. At first, the forest was inviting. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the branches, painting the forest floor in gold and red. Birds called in the distance, and the wind carried the earthy smell of wet leaves. They followed a worn trail deeper into the woods, laughing and taking photos. By nightfall, they had set up camp in a small clearing near a stream. They built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and told stories. But something felt off. The air grew unnaturally still, and shadows seemed to stretch toward them from the surrounding trees. Around 11 p.m., Ryan suggested a short walk to explore a nearby ridge. The group grabbed their flashlights and ventured into the darkness. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The paths twisted unnaturally. Areas they had passed earlier now seemed unfamiliar. Occasionally they glimpsed shadows at the edge of the light, tall, impossibly thin figures, limbs bent at unnatural angles, always watching but disappearing when approached. "It's just our imagination," Mike said nervously, but the whispering came next. Soft, almost melodic, calling their names. Ryan froze. "Did you hear that?" Suddenly a low, wet growl echoed from all directions. Something was moving behind the trees. Claire grabbed Ryan's arm. "We should go back," she whispered. They ran, but the forest had changed. Paths twisted in loops. Every trail they took seemed to lead them back to the same clearing. Branches whipped their faces, roots tangled their feet, and the growls grew closer, punctuated by faint, distorted whispers. "Stay. Join us." By midnight, panic set in. They stumbled across a strange formation in the woods, a circle of rough wooden figures, effigies carved crudely to resemble people, all staring blankly with hollow faces. Some of the effigies resembled members of the group. Ryan's stomach dropped as he recognized one with his own likeness, arms stretched unnaturally wide. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, thin, face featureless except for glowing red eyes. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, yet it moved fluidly, silently. The effigies seemed to shiver as it approached. "Run!" Ryan screamed, grabbing Jenna. They bolted, but the forest resisted. Roots and vines twisted beneath their feet, tripping them, forcing them back toward the clearing. The whispers grew louder, insistent, promising safety, promising family if they stayed. Mike tripped and fell. Claire tried to pull him up, but he screamed as unseen hands dragged him into the darkness. The others ran blindly, breathless, calling his name, until they tripped into the stream. They waded through cold water, hoping it would obscure them. Finally, exhausted and freezing, Ryan and Jenna stumbled out of the dense forest onto a small dirt road. The trailhead was empty, their car still parked, but when they looked back, the forest seemed to shift, trees moving slightly as if alive. The red-eyed figure watched from the tree line, unmoving, patient. They returned home shaken, traumatized, but neither spoke much of the incident. They didn't tell anyone about the effigies, the whispers, or the red-eyed figure. Weeks later, Ryan received a package at his apartment. Inside was a small wooden effigy, crudely carved, arms stretched, hollow eyes. A note was attached, written in jagged letters. "We are still waiting." Some nights, Ryan swears he hears whispers outside his window, soft and patient, calling his name. And deep down, he knows the forest is waiting for him to return. The forest never forgives, it never forgets, and it never lets anyone leave. Story the end. It was the summer of 2019 when a group of 6 friends from Ohio decided to take a weekend camping trip in the Allegheny National Forest. Among them were Jason, the leader and thrill seeker, Rachel, cautious but loyal to her friends, Sam, quiet and observant, Lila, sarcastic and brave, Mark, skeptical and always rationalizing danger, and Emily, gentle but with a curiosity that often led her into trouble. None of them had ever ventured deep into the forest, but they had heard rumors from locals about Whispering Pines, a section of the forest so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground, and about disappearances that were never explained. The group arrived on Friday afternoon. The trailhead was secluded, with only an old, weathered sign marking the entrance. Allegheny National Forest, trail number 17. They began hiking toward a clearing Jason had found on a map, a place near a small, unnamed creek. The early part of the hike was normal. Birds chirped, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the sunlight made patterns on the ground. By late afternoon, the forest had changed. The air grew heavier, colder, and strangely still. Birds vanished, and even the wind seemed muted. Rachel shivered. "It's too quiet," she said, but Jason shrugged it off. Lila teased her about being scared, while Sam and Emily walked ahead, scanning the forest with keen eyes. Mark, always rational, suggested they simply hadn't noticed the forest becoming quieter as they went deeper. They reached the clearing near the creek just before sunset. It was beautiful, but the stillness was unsettling. They set up camp and built a fire. As darkness fell, shadows in the trees seemed to shift unnaturally, and the forest felt as if it were closing in around them. Around midnight, Jason went to relieve himself at the edge of the clearing. A few minutes later, Emily heard him call her name, an odd, strained cry. When she ran toward the sound, she found the ground empty. No sign of Jason. No footprints leading away. Just the whispering, soft, low, voices coming from all directions, repeating her name in tones that weren't quite right. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. They huddled around the fire, taking turns shining flashlights into the surrounding trees, but nothing was visible. At dawn, Jason was still missing. Mark tried to convince the group that he might have fallen and gotten lost, but Lila and Rachel sensed something far more sinister. As they tried to retrace their path back to the trail, the forest seemed to warp. Familiar trees and landmarks disappeared. Trails they had marked with small ribbons were gone. The creek, which had been a clear guide, twisted and turned impossibly, leading them deeper into the forest rather than out. By the second night, the whispering had grown louder. It mimicked voices they recognized, Jason's voice calling for help, Mark's voice urging caution. But when they ran toward the sounds, the voices vanished. Shapes began appearing between the trees, tall, thin, humanoid figures, moving just beyond the reach of their flashlights, limbs bending in impossible angles. Sam swore he saw one of the figures mimic his exact movements. In desperation, the group stumbled upon an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods. Its roof sagged and the windows were boarded, but a faint warmth seemed to emanate from inside. They entered, hoping for shelter, but found the air thick with decay and rot. The walls were covered with carvings, twisted symbols, faces etched into wood with frozen screams, tally marks counting beyond comprehension. In the center of the floor lay remnants of bones, some fresh, some centuries old. That night, the forest seemed alive. The cabin groaned as shadows stretched and writhed. Whispering filled every corner, surrounding them with voices of the missing, of the forest itself. Lila screamed when she saw one of the tall figures press its featureless face against the window. Mark tried to rationalize it, but the fear was inescapable. By morning, Emily and Rachel realized the others had disappeared. Sam and Lila were gone. It dragged silently into the darkness while they slept fitfully, leaving only faint echoes of their screams. Emily and Rachel ran blindly through the forest, the trees bending and twisting as if guiding them back toward the cabin instead of away. For hours they ran until they stumbled upon the creek again. The water looked different, darker, almost black. Shapes moved beneath its surface, limbs bending unnaturally. The whispering intensified, calling their names, taunting them. Exhausted and terrified, they eventually followed the creek downstream and found a logging road, collapsing from exhaustion and shock. Authorities investigated the forest but found no trace of the missing four: Jason, Mark, Lila, and Sam. Emily and Rachel were taken to a hospital, suffering from extreme trauma. They tried to explain what they saw, but without evidence, the story sounded like a shared hallucination. Over the following months, both Emily and Rachel suffered nightmares and hallucinations. They reported seeing the same tall, thin figures in the corners of rooms, hearing whispers calling their names, even in their homes. Locals avoided the section of forest they had visited, warning others that Whispering Pines takes what it wants and doesn't give back. Years later, hikers still report strange occurrences: shapes moving between trees, whispers in voices of friends or family, and sudden disorientation where trails seem to loop endlessly. Those who enter often leave terrified, claiming the forest itself is alive, remembering the names of anyone who dares step inside. And deep within the shadows of Whispering Pines, the forest waits patiently for the next group of explorers to wander too far, too curious, too unaware of the hunger within. Story the end. The wind howled through the dense canopy of Maple Ridge Forest, carrying the chill of early November. The forest was notorious in the region, an expanse of tangled trees, thick underbrush, and narrow trails that seemed to shift on their own. Locals whispered that the forest took people who wandered too far, and though most dismissed it as legend, the stories were persistent, chilling, and oddly consistent. A group of 4 college friends, Ryan, Claire, Josh, and Melissa, decided to spend a weekend hiking and camping deep in Maple Ridge. They were thrill seekers, accustomed to testing their limits, and the forest's reputation intrigued rather than deterred them. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small clearing just off a barely visible trail. Ryan, the self-appointed leader of the group, suggested setting up camp there. The clearing was damp and littered with fallen branches, but it was flat enough for a tent. The forest beyond the clearing seemed unusually silent, as if it were holding its breath. "Too quiet," Melissa muttered, examining the perimeter of the clearing. "It's just the forest being the forest," Josh said with a smirk, though even he sounded uncertain. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, they lit a small fire. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the clearing, and every small sound, the drip of water, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified. Ryan tried to lighten the mood, telling stories of other haunted forests he had read about, but the laughter felt forced. Around midnight, Claire woke to the sound of snapping twigs. She nudged Melissa. "Did you hear that?" Melissa whispered back, "Probably a deer." But the sound didn't stop. It circled the clearing, close enough that they could hear the distinct crunch of leaves underfoot. Then came the low, guttural growl, long, drawn out, and impossibly close. Josh grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam revealed nothing but trees and underbrush, yet the growl persisted, circling them, growing louder. Panic set in. "Stay in the tent," Ryan said, trying to sound authoritative. "Don't make any noise." Hours passed in tense silence. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap made them jump. When dawn finally broke, they found the forest had changed. The trail they had used to arrive was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees and vines. Every direction looked identical. They wandered for hours, hoping to find a recognizable landmark. Then they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, hidden in a grove of dead oaks. The structure was old, blackened by age, and covered in moss. Broken windows revealed a dark, empty interior. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. The floorboards creaked underfoot. On the walls were strange symbols etched into the wood. Angular, repetitive marks that resembled a language but made no sense. In the corner lay a pile of bones, small animal bones, mixed with shards of human teeth and fragments of clothing. Melissa gagged. What is this?" Josh, trying to steady his voice, said, "We should leave. Now." But when they turned to exit, a shadow moved across the far wall, a figure impossibly tall and thin, with long, spindly arms ending in clawed fingers. Its face was smooth and featureless, except for a faint slit where a mouth should have been. It tilted its head unnaturally, studying them. Claire screamed. The figure moved with unnatural speed, disappearing into the forest outside. The friends ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth. Branches tore at their clothes, roots tripped them, and the forest seemed to twist, reshaping itself to keep them inside. Night fell again. Exhausted, frightened, and disoriented, they tried to find shelter. They stumbled into a second clearing, this one containing a stone circle. The center was littered with human and animal bones, some fresh, some decayed. The stones were blackened and wet, as if burned. A whispering filled the air, calling their names in voices distorted and familiar. Panic overtook them. Josh ran toward the forest edge and vanished with a scream. Melissa collapsed, sobbing, and Ryan and Claire grabbed her, trying to drag her away. From the shadows, the figure emerged, joined by others, tall, thin, faceless creatures moving silently. They circled the friends, cutting off every path of escape. The whispering grew louder, incomprehensible but insistent, seeping into their minds, twisting their perception of the forest. Hours, or was it days, passed. The friends were separated, dragged in different directions. Claire managed to flee for a time, crawling through the underbrush until she stumbled into a creek and lost consciousness. When she awoke, she was alone, somewhere deep in the forest. Her friends were gone. The sun was low, though she couldn't tell if it was the same day. Every path she tried led back to the same stone circle, the same pile of bones, and the same oppressive feeling of being watched. Weeks later, search teams would comb Maple Ridge Forest. They found evidence of recent human activity, footprints leading in, none leading out, flattened campsites, a tent torn apart. But no bodies, no survivors. Only the forest, dense and silent, waiting for its next victims. Locals continued to warn. The forest collects the lost, reshapes paths, erases evidence. Those who wander too far never return, and sometimes at night, travelers can hear whispers calling their names, carrying over the wind, coming from no direction and all directions at once. The forest waits. It always waits. Story the end. It was mid-October when a group of 6 friends from Ohio, Ben, Sarah, Tyler, Mia, Josh, and Rachel, decided to take a weekend camping trip in the forests of western Pennsylvania. They had heard whispers of a place called Black Pine Hollow, a remote, heavily wooded area that locals avoided. The stories ranged from strange lights flickering between the trees to hikers vanishing without a trace. Being in their early 20s and hungry for adventure, they dismissed the warnings as small-town superstition. They arrived mid-afternoon and set up camp near a clearing that seemed ideal. A small creek ran alongside it, and the ground was relatively flat. The sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows, and the air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. At first, everything was normal. They laughed, cooked their dinner over the fire, and shared ghost stories, each one trying to outdo the other. As twilight approached, Ben suggested a short hike to explore deeper into the forest. "It's just a quick walk," he said. "We'll be back before it gets dark." The trail they took was narrow and overgrown. It quickly became apparent that no one had walked this path in years. Branches snagged at their clothing, roots tripped their steps, and the air grew colder, damper. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds or insects were absent, replaced only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. About 40 minutes in, Sarah paused, her flashlight illuminating a figure between the trees. "Did you guys see that?" she whispered. Tyler squinted into the darkness. "See what?" The figure moved fast, almost too fast to track, and disappeared before anyone could get a clear look. The forest seemed to close in, shadows deepening unnaturally. A low rustling came from the underbrush, like something large was moving just out of sight. "Probably a deer," Josh muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The group pressed on, but unease grew. The trail began to twist and split in confusing ways, paths seeming to lead back to where they started no matter which way they turned. That's when the whispers began. At first, it was faint, just the soft sound of someone calling a name. Then louder, clearer. "Ben, Ben, Sarah, come closer." Mia froze. That's not possible," she said, shaking. "We're alone here." Suddenly, the rustling erupted into violent movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, impossibly tall, limbs bending at strange angles, skin pale and streaked with mud. Its face was featureless, except for two black holes where its eyes should have been. It tilted its head unnaturally and took a step forward. Screams erupted as the group scattered. Branches clawed at their arms and legs, roots tripped their feet, and the forest seemed to shift around them. Every attempt to retrace their steps ended at the same clearing. Rachel was the first to vanish. 1 second she was running beside Tyler, the next she had disappeared. Her scream echoed, then was swallowed by the trees. Panic-stricken, the remaining 5 ran blindly until they stumbled upon a ruined cabin, hidden deep in the forest. Inside, the air was stale, thick with decay. The walls were covered in scratches and symbols carved into the wood. Shadows moved across the walls as if the room itself were alive. The group huddled together, too terrified to speak. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, like knuckles on wood, then louder, more deliberate. Something pressed against the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The creature, or creatures, were all around them. Whispers filled the cabin, voices imitating each of them, calling their names, repeating their thoughts, mocking their fear. One by one, they tried to escape. Mia ran and was pulled into the darkness by unseen hands. Tyler followed and was gone in seconds. Josh, paralyzed with terror, couldn't move as the whispers grew louder, echoing inside his head. Only Ben and Sarah remained. They ran together until they found a narrow stream cutting through the forest. The water reflected moonlight, and for a brief moment, it seemed like an escape. They followed it, hoping it led out. But the forest shifted once again, closing in, reshaping itself, twisting into a maze that had no end. When dawn finally broke, only Ben emerged from Black Pine Hollow. He stumbled onto an old logging road, exhausted, covered in scratches and dirt, his clothes torn. He had no idea how long he had been in the forest. Sarah and the others were gone. Authorities found no trace of them, not even footprints. Ben tried to tell his story, but no one believed him. Even years later, he hears whispers when the wind blows through pine trees. Sometimes in the corner of his eye, he sees figures moving between shadows, tall, thin, faceless. He knows that Black Pine Hollow never lets anyone go entirely. Those who vanish still exist within it, calling out to anyone foolish enough to wander too deep. And if you listen carefully, locals say, the forest is always listening, always waiting. Patient enough to let you wander until it decides you belong there too. Story, the end. The sun had just disappeared behind the dense canopy when Carter, his brother Liam, and their friends Jenna and Marcus arrived at the edge of Greywood Forest in northern Vermont. The forest was notorious among locals. Stories of hikers disappearing without a trace, strange lights moving through the trees, and a constant, unnatural whispering that carried with the wind. They parked their old pickup truck near a worn trailhead, its wooden sign half-rotted and covered in moss. Greywood Trail, keep out after dusk. Carter shrugged. We'll be fine. Just a night hike and a campsite. What's the worst that could happen? Liam frowned, glancing into the shadows of the towering pines. I don't know, man. Something about this place feels wrong. Don't be a baby, Marcus said, laughing. It's just trees. They set off down the narrow trail, flashlights cutting arcs through the encroaching darkness. The forest smelled damp, earthy, and metallic, a sharp, unsettling tang that made Carter's stomach tighten. Every so often, branches snapped behind them, but whenever they turned, there was nothing. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and stretch, unnaturally long and deliberate. After about an hour, they reached a small clearing by a stagnant pond. The water reflected the pale moonlight, broken by ripples that had no apparent source. They set up camp and built a small fire, trying to laugh off the tension. Hours passed. The fire flickered, and an uneasy silence replaced their earlier chatter. Then came the whispers, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but growing louder, sharper, forming words. They called their names, sometimes their own voices, sometimes voices that sounded familiar, but wrong. "Do you hear that?" Jenna whispered, clutching her jacket. Marcus shined his flashlight around. "It's just the wind. Trees make noise." But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to move, circling the campsite. Carter felt eyes on him, though no one was there. Then he saw it. A figure between the trees, tall and thin, limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its gaze was impossible to ignore. Panic set in. They grabbed their packs and ran, plunging deeper into the forest. Every path they tried seemed to loop back, every tree the same as the last. Branches tore at their clothes and skin, roots tripped them, and the fog crept in, thick and suffocating. By nightfall, they were hopelessly lost. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst burned their throats, and fear had taken full control. The whispers grew louder, now forming sentences. "You can't leave. Stay with us." Their own voices mimicked them, calling out from the fog. They stumbled upon a cabin, long abandoned and decaying. Its roof sagged, windows shattered. Inside, the floor was littered with debris and old bones arranged in spirals. Scratched into the wall were the words, "The forest takes what it wants." Horrified, they fled. Outside, the fog had thickened. Shapes moved just beyond the firelight, tall, thin, faceless, yet somehow resembling them. The forest seemed alive, breathing, reshaping itself to trap them. By the third night, Marcus had disappeared. A scream in the distance faded into silence. They called his name until their voices cracked. Liam was the next to vanish, dragged into the fog while trying to climb a hill for vantage. Carter and Jenna pressed on, stumbling blindly through the twisted forest. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, and whispers called from every direction. At one point, they paused in a clearing where the trees formed arches overhead, creating a tunnel into darkness. From the tunnel, dozens of figures emerged. They were tall, thin, and featureless. Yet their movements were disturbingly human. Some wore the faces of people Carter knew, twisted and lifeless. One stepped forward. Its face was Jenna's, pale and stretched into a smile that did not reach its eyes. Carter grabbed her hand, fleeing, but she began laughing, a high, unnatural sound that pierced the forest like glass. She broke free and ran into the fog. Carter chased, calling her name, but only her distorted laughter answered. Days blurred into nights. Carter's mind frayed. Hunger and exhaustion consumed him. The forest never ended. Every path led back to the same clearing, the same trees, the same oppressive fog. He began to hear voices even when alone, Jenna's, Marcus's, Liam's, pleading, mocking, guiding him deeper into the woods. No one ever found Carter, Jenna, Marcus, or Liam. Weeks later, hikers discovered torn backpacks and tattered tents near the edge of the forest. Cameras left behind captured only faint silhouettes among the trees, figures too tall and thin, always watching. Graywood Forest remained, patient, endless, and hungry, and those who entered too far were never seen again. Story the end. It was late September when Dylan, his sister Mia, and their friends Connor and Paige drove to the edge of Nightfall Forest, a remote woodland in northern Vermont. The forest had a reputation. Locals whispered of hikers disappearing without a trace, strange lights floating between the trees, and whispers that seemed to echo from nowhere. The group ignored the warnings, eager for a weekend of camping and adventure. They parked at a small gravel clearing near a decaying trailhead sign. Nightfall Forest. Enter at your own risk. Dylan shrugged. It's just a forest. How scary can it be? Mia hesitated, glancing into the shadows. It already feels wrong. Connor laughed. Stop worrying. Let's set up camp and enjoy ourselves. They hiked down the narrow trail, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was damp, earthy, and metallic. Branches snapped behind them from time to time, though nothing appeared when they turned. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching long and deliberate, as if alive. After an hour, they found a small clearing near a stagnant stream. They set up tents and built a fire. The flickering flames cast grotesque shadows across the trees. Laughter echoed hollowly, quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. Around midnight, Dylan awoke to soft whispering. At first, it sounded like the wind, but the words became clear. Names being called, sometimes familiar, sometimes distorted, wrong. "Do you hear that?" Paige whispered. Connor shined his flashlight around. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice trembled. The whispers moved around them, circling the campsite. Dylan felt unseen eyes watching. Then he saw it, a tall, thin figure among the trees, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden, yet its gaze was patient, hungry, infinite. Panic took hold. They ran blindly into the forest, tripping over roots, tearing their clothes on branches. Every path led back to the same clearing. Fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, clinging to their skin. By the second night, fear and exhaustion were overwhelming. The whispers had formed sentences. "You cannot leave. Stay with us." Their own voices echoed back from the darkness. They stumbled upon a ruined cabin, blackened and sagging. Bones lay on the floor in spirals. Scratched into the wall were the words, "The forest takes all who enter horrified." They fled. Outside, the fog thickened, and tall, thin, faceless figures appeared. Some wore the faces of people they knew, twisted into lifeless imitations. By the third night, Connor vanished, dragged silently into the fog. Paige disappeared next. Dylan and Mia pressed onward, desperate, slipping through ever-changing paths. The forest itself seemed alive, closing in around them. They reached a clearing where the trees arched unnaturally, forming a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the far end. From it, dozens of figures emerged, some wearing the faces of the missing. One stepped forward, Mia's face, pale and twisted into a grotesque smile. Dylan grabbed her hand, but she dissolved into the fog. He ran blindly, calling her name, but only distorted laughter answered. No one ever saw Dylan, Mia, Connor, or Paige again. Weeks later, hikers discovered remnants of their campsite, torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees. Figures too tall, too thin, always watching, always patient. Nightfall Forest remained, endless, hungry, and waiting. Those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story, the end. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon when Ethan, Mia, Jake, and Rachel reached the outskirts of Ashwood Forest. The town nearby had whispered about it for decades. Campers, hikers, and hunters disappearing, strange lights flickering between the trees, and an oppressive silence that descended without warning. But the four friends wanted the thrill, convinced that the stories were exaggerated. They parked their SUV at the edge of a crumbling gravel road and stepped onto a barely visible trail. The air was damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and decay. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. "This is eerie," Mia said, hugging her jacket. "Perfect for footage," Ethan replied, holding up his camera. "Nothing like this anywhere else." The first mile was quiet. Sunlight filtered weakly through the thick canopy, making the woods seem darker than they were. By late afternoon, they found a clearing beside a small, stagnant pond. They set up a small campfire and pitched their tent. Night fell quickly, and the forest seemed to come alive in unnatural ways. Twigs snapped around them, and a low, scraping sound began circling the camp. Then came whispers, soft, distorted, calling their names. Ethan shone his flashlight, revealing only trees. Shadows stretched and shifted unnaturally. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the night, a long, guttural, inhuman sound. The group froze, hearts pounding. Morning brought no relief. The trail they had used was gone, replaced by thick undergrowth. Every direction looked identical. Panic set in. Hours later, they stumbled upon a ruined cabin, blackened with age, windows shattered, and the door hanging crooked. Inside, the walls were carved with strange symbols and countless tally marks. In one corner lay bones, animal and human, arranged in unsettling patterns. From the shadows, a figure emerged, impossibly tall, thin, with elongated limbs ending in black claws. Its face was featureless except for a thin slit where its mouth should have been. It tilted its head unnaturally, observing them. Panic erupted. Ethan swung a tripod, but the figure moved faster than the eye could follow, disappearing into the darkness outside. The friends fled blindly, the forest itself seeming to twist and shift, roots and branches blocking escape. Night fell again. Whispering voices echoed, imitating loved ones, luring them deeper. Jake was the first taken, dragged into the shadows with a scream that ended abruptly. Rachel vanished moments later. Only Ethan and Mia remained, stumbling into a stone circle in the forest center, littered with bones. Whispering surrounded them from every direction. Mia was dragged away, leaving Ethan alone. Exhausted and terrified, he wandered until he collapsed near a creek, hearing distorted voices calling his name. He realized the forest had no exit. It waited, patient and relentless. Weeks later, search teams found only traces of camping. Footprints leading in, none leading out. No bodies. Only the dense, unending forest remained, silently claiming the lost. Locals continue to warn. Ashwood Forest collects the lost, reshapes paths, and watches patiently. At night, whispers call your name, and shadows move faster than any human could. Those who hear it rarely return. Ashwood waits. It always waits. Story the end. It began in late September when a group of college friends, Derek, Anna, Lucas, Mia, and I, planned a weekend camping trip in the dense Timberfall forest of northern Washington. Timberfall was notorious locally. Hikers occasionally disappeared. Hunters claimed they saw strange shapes moving between the trees, and some sections of the forest were said to shift when no one was looking. We didn't care. Adventure mattered more than superstition. We arrived mid-morning, the forest thick with firs and cedars. Sunlight barely touched the ground, filtered through the dense canopy, and the air smelled of damp pine and decomposing leaves. The trail we followed was narrow, overgrown, and often indistinct. Birds were sparse, and after a few hours, complete silence settled over the woods. Not the quiet of nature, but a heavy, oppressive stillness. By mid-afternoon, Lucas spotted footprints along a narrow, muddy path. Barefoot, human-shaped, but elongated, with toes that seemed unnaturally long. They led deeper into the forest, away from the trail. Probably just a hiker, Lucas said, though his voice wavered. Curiosity got the better of us. Against Anna and Mia's hesitation, we followed the prints. As we ventured further, the forest felt alive. Trees bent in impossible ways. Roots twisted like snakes across the ground. Shadows moved unnaturally at the edges of our vision, tall, thin, pale figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. Whenever we looked directly, they vanished. By evening, the sun was low, but the forest seemed darker than it should have been. Fog rolled in, thick and choking. Then the whispers started, soft at first, barely audible, then clear. Derek, Anna, Lucas, Mia, Michael. Suddenly Mia screamed. She had vanished, leaving only her backpack tangled in a root. Panic consumed us. Derek grabbed Anna and Lucas, and we ran blindly, tripping over roots, branches tearing at our skin, the forest seeming to shift underfoot. Shapes moved between the trees, pale, humanoid with long limbs, gliding silently. Hours later, exhausted, we stumbled into a small clearing. An abandoned cabin crouched beneath moss and vines. Inside, the walls were etched with tall stick figures, faceless, elongated, with small notches along their limbs. One figure had Mia's initials carved into it. The whispers intensified, circling us inside the cabin. Cold air swept through, though the forest outside remained still. Outside, figures emerged from the fog, tall, thin, pale, eyes black, limbs impossibly long, moving silently. Derek grabbed my arm, and we fled again. By dawn, only Derek and I reached the edge of the forest. Lucas and Anna were gone. Search parties later found no trace, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Only the mud near the cabin bore the elongated barefoot tracks, leading deeper into the forest, never out. Locals now avoid Timberfall entirely. Hikers report whispers calling their names, pale, faceless figures standing silently between the trees, and barefoot footprints leading further into the woods. Some say the forest collects people, adding them to the endless procession of shapes that wander barefoot, watching, waiting for the next careless wanderers. Years later, when the wind rustles through pine near my home, I sometimes hear whispers, my name among them, and I know Timberfall Forest still remembers me. Story the end. It began on a cold October morning when a group of 5 friends, Ethan, Claire, Jason, Megan, and I, decided to hike the remote Ravenwood Forest in northern Idaho. The forest was infamous locally, not for any single tragedy, but for disappearances spanning decades. Hunters, hikers, even park rangers had vanished there, sometimes leaving only footprints that led nowhere. We were young and skeptical. We didn't believe in cursed forests. Adventure mattered more than caution. We arrived late morning, carrying backpacks, tents, and supplies for the weekend. The forest was dense, the trees tall and tight, their branches forming a near impenetrable canopy. The air smelled of damp pine, moss, and earth. Birds called occasionally, but the deeper we went, the quieter it became. By afternoon, it was eerily silent. Not peaceful quiet. The kind that made you notice your heartbeat, but a weight pressing on us, the forest holding its breath. As we trekked deeper, Ethan noticed footprints in the soft dirt near a stream. They were barefoot, human, but oddly long, toes splayed unnaturally, leading off the trail into the undergrowth. "Probably someone camping out here," he said, but his voice lacked confidence. Curiosity got the better of us. We followed the prints. The forest seemed to twist unnaturally as we moved forward. Familiar landmarks disappeared. Trees bent and leaned in impossible directions, roots tangled underfoot, and shadows flickered at the edge of our vision, tall, thin, pale figures with limbs too long, faces blank. Every time we looked directly, they vanished. By nightfall, panic set in. The trail had vanished. Our GPS didn't work, cell service was non-existent, and the fog thickened, swallowing everything familiar. The first whispers began, soft and incomprehensible at first, then clear. Ethan, Claire, Jason, Megan, Michael. Suddenly Megan screamed. She had disappeared, leaving only her jacket snagged on a branch. We ran blindly, hearts hammering, lungs burning. Branches tore at our clothes and skin. Roots tripped us, and the forest seemed to shift beneath our feet. Hours later, we stumbled into a small hollow, where an abandoned cabin crouched beneath layers of moss. Inside, the walls were carved with tall, thin stick figures, faceless, with elongated limbs and small notches along their bodies. One figure bore Megan's initials. The whispers grew louder, circling us. Cold air swept through the cabin, though the surrounding forest was still. Outside, shapes moved in the fog. Tall, pale humanoids, eyes black and reflective, limbs impossibly long, gliding silently through the trees. Ethan grabbed my arm, and we fled again, weaving blindly through the forest. By dawn, only Ethan and I made it out. Claire and Jason were gone. Rescue teams later found no trace of them, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Only the mud near the cabin bore the elongated barefoot tracks, leading deeper into the forest, never back out. Locals now warn hikers to avoid Ravenwood. People report seeing pale figures standing motionless between the trees, whispers calling their names, and footprints appearing in the mud, leading deeper into the forest. Some say the forest collects people, turning them into faceless, barefoot shapes that wander among the trees, waiting for the next wanderers to follow the wrong trail. I never returned. But sometimes when the wind moves through the pines at night, I hear whispers, my name among them, and I know that Ravenwood Forest still remembers. Story the end. It was the fall of 2025 when a group of 5 college friends, Jake, Mia, Carter, Olivia, and Liam, decided to spend a weekend camping in the remote Hollow Pines Forest of western Pennsylvania. The forest had long been infamous among locals. Stories spoke of hikers disappearing without a trace, strange lights flickering between the trees at night, and whispers that seemed to echo the voices of the living. The friends, eager for adventure, dismissed the warnings as superstition. They arrived late Friday afternoon, backpacks heavy and spirits high. Jake, the leader, had mapped a route to a secluded clearing near a narrow creek. Mia, cautious and analytical, worried about leaving the marked trails. Carter and Liam, both thrill seekers, encouraged the shortcut, teasing Mia for being overly careful. Olivia followed quietly, keeping her eyes on the dense forest around them. At first, the hike seemed ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the tall oaks and pines, birds chirped, and the creek babbled over rocks. But as they went deeper, the forest became unnaturally silent. Birds vanished, the creek slowed, and the air grew cold and heavy. Shadows seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally, and an oppressive stillness settled over the group. By late afternoon, they reached the clearing. Moss-covered rocks and leaning trees surrounded the narrow creek, and a thick fog began to creep along the ground. They set up camp and built a fire. That night, as darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in. Shadows writhed, moving independently of the firelight, and the wind carried faint, whispering voices calling their names. Around midnight, Carter wandered toward the tree line to relieve himself. A few minutes later, Olivia screamed. Carter had vanished. His flashlight lay on the ground, trembling in the firelight. Then came the whispering, louder now, voices distorted, mimicking the friends' own tones, beckoning them into the forest. By dawn, Liam disappeared while checking the perimeter. Panic overtook the remaining 3, Jake, Mia, and Olivia. They tried to retrace their path, but the forest seemed to resist them. Paths looped impossibly, landmarks shifted, and the creek no longer followed the same course. The whispering followed relentlessly, growing more insistent, more malevolent. On the second night, the trio stumbled upon an abandoned ranger cabin hidden deep in a hollow. Its roof sagged, windows boarded, and inside the air was thick with rot. Jagged symbols and tally marks were carved into the walls, some counting beyond reason. Bones littered the floor, some fresh, some centuries old. Words etched into the wood read, "The forest remembers. You cannot leave." As darkness fell, the forest seemed alive. Tall, thin figures emerged from the trees, limbs bending unnaturally. Faceless shapes pressed against the windows, circling the cabin, whispering voices rising to anguished screams. Mia and Olivia tried to flee, but were separated in the chaos. Jake ran blindly, eventually stumbling onto a logging road at dawn. Authorities searched Hollow Pines Forest, but found no trace of Carter, Liam, or Olivia. Jake was hospitalized, traumatized, haunted by visions of tall, faceless figures and relentless whispering. To this day, Hollow Pines Forest remains feared. Hikers report shifting trails, shadows moving independently of light, and whispers calling their names. Those who enter rarely return unchanged, if they return at all. And deep within the heart of Hollow Pines, the forest waits, patient, aware, and hungry, remembering every name, every sound, every step of those who dare to enter. Story the end. The sun had long set when Nathan, his cousin Lily, and their friends Eric and Jenna arrived at the edge of Ashwood Forest, a dense, isolated woodland in northern Maine. The forest was infamous among locals. Disappearances, strange lights moving through the trees, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. But the group dismissed the stories as superstition, eager for a weekend away from the city. They parked at a gravel clearing by a decaying trailhead sign. Ashwood Forest, enter at your own risk. Nathan shrugged. It's just trees. What's the worst that could happen? Lily hesitated. It already feels wrong. Eric laughed. Relax. Let's set up camp and enjoy ourselves. They hiked down the narrow trail, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The air was damp and metallic, smelling of wet leaves and decay. Branches snapped behind them from time to time, though nothing appeared when they turned. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting in ways that made them feel alive. After an hour, they found a small clearing near a stagnant pond. They set up tents and built a fire, attempting to mask their unease with laughter. The flickering flames threw grotesque shapes across the trees. Even as they joked, the forest seemed to swallow their voices, growing oppressive. Around midnight, Nathan awoke to soft whispering. At first, it was indistinguishable from the wind, but it quickly formed words, calling their names, sometimes familiar, sometimes distorted, wrong. Do you hear that? Jenna whispered. Eric swung his flashlight around. It's just the wind, he said, though his voice trembled. The whispers moved around the campsite, circling them. Nathan felt unseen eyes watching. Then he saw it, a figure among the trees, impossibly tall and thin, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden, but the gaze was infinite, patient, hungry. Panic consumed them. They ran blindly, tripping over roots and tearing their clothes on branches. Every path led back to the same clearing. Fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, clinging to their skin. By the second night, exhaustion and fear had consumed them. The whispers became sentences. You cannot leave. Stay with us. Their own voices echoed from the fog. They stumbled upon a ruined cabin, its walls blackened and sagging. Bones lay on the floor, arranged in spirals. Scratched into the wall were words, "The forest takes all who enter." They fled. Outside, the fog had thickened, and tall, thin, faceless figures emerged. Some wore the twisted faces of people they knew. By the third night, Eric vanished, dragged silently into the fog. Jenna disappeared next. Nathan and Lily pressed onward, desperate, slipping through ever-changing paths. The forest itself seemed alive, closing in around them. They reached a clearing where the trees arched unnaturally, forming a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the far end. From it, dozens of figures emerged, some wearing the faces of the missing. One stepped forward, Lily's face pale and twisted into a grotesque smile. Nathan grabbed her, but she dissolved into the fog. He ran blindly, calling her name, but only distorted laughter answered. No one ever saw Nathan, Lily, Eric, or Jenna again. Weeks later, hikers discovered remnants of their campsite, torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees, figures too tall, too thin, always watching, always patient. Ashwood Forest remained, endless, hungry, and waiting. Those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story, the end. It was the last weekend of October when a group of 6 friends from New Jersey, Tyler, Olivia, Marcus, Jenna, Liam, and Rachel, decided to go camping in the remote forests of the Pocono Mountains. They had heard about a place locals called Darkroot Hollow, a stretch of old-growth forest so thick and untamed that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. Tales of hikers disappearing and strange, whispering voices were common among town residents, but the friends dismissed the warnings as folklore. They arrived mid-afternoon, the forest looming around them like a wall of green and brown. They set up camp in a small clearing near a creek and spent the first few hours exploring the outskirts, taking photos and laughing. The forest was unnervingly quiet, though. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced only by the rustling of leaves under their boots. As dusk fell, the forest seemed to grow heavier, with the shadows stretching unnaturally. Around 9:30 p.m., Tyler suggested a short hike along an overgrown trail. "We'll just check it out and be back in an hour," he said, flashlight in hand. Reluctantly, the others agreed. The trail quickly became narrow and tangled. Roots snagged their boots, branches clawed at their clothes and faces. The forest seemed to shift as they walked. Paths that looked clear a moment ago were suddenly blocked by thick undergrowth. Then came the whispers. At first, faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Then louder, calling their names individually. "Olivia, come here." "Marcus, don't be afraid." They froze, staring into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the trees in familiar voices, some even imitating their own. Then movement. A figure appeared, impossibly tall, limbs bent at unnatural angles, its pale face stretched tight with hollow black eyes, its head tilted unnaturally as it observed them. Panic overtook the group. Rachel screamed as the figure darted between the trees, moving faster than any human could. They ran blindly, crashing into roots and branches, trying to escape. But the forest seemed to fold in on itself. Every path led back to the same clearing, the forest twisting around them. Hours, or perhaps minutes, time lost meaning, they stumbled upon a decrepit cabin hidden deep within the woods. Its walls were rotting, windows broken, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Desperate, they ran inside and barricaded it with whatever debris they could find. The cabin was suffocating. Deep scratches marred the walls, the air thick with the smell of decay. Outside, branches tapped and scraped against the structure, deliberate and rhythmic. The whispers followed them inside, echoing their voices, mocking them. One by one, the friends were taken. Liam ran and vanished into the shadows. Marcus tried to hold the door closed, but unseen hands dragged him away. Jenna and Rachel disappeared while huddled together, leaving only Tyler and Olivia. They ran blindly through the forest, the trees twisting, roots tangling their feet, branches clawing their faces. Shadows flickered at the edge of vision, and the whispers never stopped. By dawn, only Tyler emerged from Darkroot Hollow, stumbling onto an old logging road, alone, exhausted, and bloodied. Authorities found no trace of the others. Tyler's story was dismissed as delirium, but locals warned him never to return. Even years later, he hears whispers when the wind blows through trees, sees shadows in the corner of his eyes, and sometimes dreams of being trapped in Darkroot Hollow again. The forest waits, patient, eternal. It doesn't just trap bodies, it traps minds, and those it claims never truly leave. Story the end. It was late September when 5 friends, Evan, Lily, Sean, Chloe, and Marcus, drove to the remote forests outside of Ashfield, Vermont. The area was known as Hollow Pines, a dense, ancient woodland locals avoided. Stories of hikers disappearing, sometimes for days, sometimes forever, were whispered at town gatherings. Rumors spoke of figures glimpsed between the trees, tall, unnaturally thin, always watching. But the friends were eager for adventure, dismissing the warnings as superstition. They arrived mid-afternoon, sunlight filtering through the dense canopy, the forest floor carpeted with damp leaves. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and moss. Birds were silent, and even the wind seemed muted. At first, the hike was enjoyable, the friends laughing and taking photos along the twisting trail. By evening, they reached a small clearing near a creek and set up camp. The fire crackled, illuminating the shadows of the surrounding trees. But the shadows seemed longer than natural, stretching toward them, bending unnaturally. Lily noticed movement at the edge of her vision. Tall, thin figures with impossibly long limbs, but each time she blinked, they were gone. Around 11 p.m., Evan suggested exploring a nearby ridge for the view of the valley under the moonlight. Despite Chloe's protests, the group grabbed their flashlights and ventured into the darkness. Immediately, the forest began to shift. Paths twisted, familiar trees disappeared, and shadows moved with a deliberate, intelligent awareness, always just out of reach. Then came the whispers, faint at first, almost melodic. Evan, Lily, Sean, Chloe, Marcus. The voices grew louder, echoing from all directions. Sean laughed nervously, trying to rationalize it, but the whispers persisted, guiding them deeper into the forest. A low, wet growl sounded. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall, distorted, limbs bending at impossible angles, faces blank or blurred. The ground shifted beneath them as roots and vines coiled, trying to ensnare the friends. In the center of the clearing, rough wooden effigies were scattered, each carved crudely but eerily resembling someone in the group. Evan froze as he recognized one with his own likeness, arms outstretched, hollow eyes staring. The tallest figure stepped forward, impossibly thin, red eyes glowing. "Stay! Join us!" The whispers echoed, pressing against their minds. Panic erupted. Sean screamed as unseen hands dragged him into the shadows. Lily tried to fight, but roots coiled around her legs, pulling her backward. Chloe ran, Evan chasing, but the forest twisted to trap her. Marcus vanished silently, swallowed by the darkness. By dawn, Evan stumbled out onto a dirt road, exhausted, mud-streaked, clothes torn. The forest behind him shifted subtly, trees moving as if alive, and he swore he could see the red-eyed figure watching him from the tree line. Weeks later, Evan received a small wooden effigy in the mail. Arms stretched, hollow eyes, a crude likeness of himself. A note, jaggedly written, read, "We are still waiting." Some nights, Evan hears whispers outside his window, soft and patient, calling his name. The forest waits, eternal and relentless. It never forgets, never forgives, and it never lets anyone leave. Story the end. The wind carried a sharp chill as Logan, his sister Emily, and their friends David and Sarah approached the edge of Whispering Pines Forest. The town of Ashford had long warned travelers to avoid the forest, claiming that people who entered never returned, or if they did, they came back. Wrong. But Logan was stubborn, driven by the thrill of exploring the infamous woods. They parked near a gravel pull-off and stepped onto the narrow trail. The forest was dense, its trees tall and gnarled, blocking the last rays of sunlight. Fog clung to the underbrush, and the air smelled damp and earthy. "This is creepy," Sarah murmured, hugging her jacket. "Perfect," Logan said, holding up his camera. Great for footage. The first mile passed uneventfully, but the silence was oppressive. Birds were absent, and no animal stirred, only the faint crunch of their footsteps on leaves. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing beside a stream. They set up camp and lit a fire. The forest seemed to lean in around them, almost listening. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air grew thick with tension. As night fell, the first sounds began, twigs snapping, faint scraping, and a low, guttural growl circling the camp. Logan shined the flashlight, revealing nothing but dark trunks. Then came the whispers, soft at first, almost unintelligible, then clearer, calling their names. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, long and distorted, impossibly human, yet wrong. The group froze. David whispered, "It's not an animal." Morning brought no relief. The trail they had followed to reach the clearing had vanished, replaced by impenetrable undergrowth. Every direction looked identical. Panic set in. Hours later, they discovered a decaying cabin hidden among the trees. Its windows were shattered, wood blackened and rotted. Inside, the air was thick and foul, and the walls were covered in strange symbols and deep tally marks. In one corner lay bones, small animals mixed with human fragments. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, thin, with limbs unnaturally long ending in black claws. Its face was featureless except for a thin slit where a mouth should have been. It tilted its head, observing them with unnatural patience. Panic overtook the group. Logan swung a tripod at the creature, but it moved impossibly fast, disappearing into the darkness. They ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush. The forest seemed alive, roots twisting to block escape, branches clawing at their faces. Night fell again. Whispering voices echoed, imitating loved ones, driving them to hysteria. Sarah was pulled into the shadows first, her scream abruptly ending. David vanished moments later. Emily and Logan ran until they stumbled upon a stone circle littered with bones. Whispering surrounded them from all directions. Emily was dragged into darkness, leaving Logan alone. Exhausted, terrified, he wandered until he collapsed near the creek, listening to distorted voices calling his name. The forest had no exit. Weeks later, search teams scoured Whispering Pines. They found traces of camping, footprints leading in, but none leading out. No bodies. Only the dense, unending forest remained, silently waiting. Locals still warn, the forest collects the lost, reshapes paths, and watches patiently. Sometimes at night, whispers call your name and shadows move against the wind. Those who hear it rarely return. Whispering Pines waits. It always waits. Story the end. It was early November when a group of college friends, Ethan, Sarah, Dylan, Claire, and Mark, decided to escape the city and camp in the remote forests of upstate New York. They had heard whispers about a place the locals called Hollow Shade Woods, a stretch of dense, ancient forest where hikers sometimes disappeared and eerie lights were seen at night. Being in their early 20s, they laughed off the warnings as old town superstition. They arrived in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, filtering through the tall pines. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. They set up camp in a small clearing near a creek, cooked their dinner over a fire, and told ghost stories, laughing at each other's fear. But as darkness fell, the forest seemed to grow heavier, shadows thickening unnaturally. Around 9:30 p.m., Dylan suggested exploring a nearby trail deeper into the forest. "It's just a short hike," he said. "We'll be back before it's too late." Flashlights in hand, the group followed him. At first, the trail seemed normal, though overgrown and narrow, but soon the path became confusing, twisting in impossible directions. The trees grew closer, their branches like skeletal hands blocking the sky. The forest seemed to shift around them. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, calling their names individually. "Ethan, come here. Sarah, don't be afraid." The group froze, their nerves raw. The voices grew louder, echoing in tones that sounded familiar, almost like people they knew or remembered from their past. Then movement in the shadows. A figure emerged, impossibly tall, thin, limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its face was pale, stretched tight, with black hollow eyes, its head tilted unnaturally as it observed them. Panic erupted. Claire screamed as the figure darted forward, moving faster than any human could. They ran blindly through the forest, branches clawing at their clothes and faces, roots tripping their steps. Every path led back to the same clearing, the forest folding in on itself. Hours, or maybe minutes, they couldn't tell, passed. Exhausted, they found an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Its walls were rotted, windows shattered, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Desperate, they ran inside and barricaded it with fallen boards. The cabin was suffocating. Deep scratches covered the walls, some fresh, some old. The air smelled of damp decay. Outside, branches tapped and scraped the walls rhythmically. The whispers followed them inside, imitating their voices, mocking their fear. One by one, the friends were taken. Dylan ran and was pulled into the darkness. Mark tried to hold the door closed, but unseen hands dragged him away. Sarah and Claire disappeared while huddled together, leaving Ethan alone. Ethan ran blindly, had the forest twisting and bending around him. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision. Roots wrapped around his ankles, branches scratched his face, and the whispers never stopped. Hours later, he emerged onto an old logging road, alone, exhausted, and bleeding. Authorities found no trace of the others. Ethan's story was dismissed, but locals warned him never to return. Even years later, he hears whispers when the wind moves through trees, sees shadows at the corner of his eyes, and sometimes dreams of Hollow Shade Woods reclaiming him. The forest waits, patient and eternal. It doesn't just trap bodies, it traps minds. And those it takes never truly leave. Story the end. It was the fall of 2023 when 5 friends from upstate New York, Tyler, Hannah, Ethan, Sarah, and Logan, decided to take a weekend camping trip in the remote Hemlock Ridge Forest. The forest was known among locals for strange occurrences, hikers disappearing without a trace, shadows moving independently of light, and whispers that seemed to call your name. The friends, young and adventurous, dismissed the warnings as superstition and were eager to explore the untouched wilderness. They arrived late Friday afternoon, backpacks loaded, spirits high. Tyler, the unofficial leader, had studied old forest maps and planned a route to a secluded clearing near a narrow, winding creek. Hannah, cautious and practical, warned about venturing too deep off marked trails. Ethan and Logan, thrill seekers, encouraged Tyler, teasing Hannah for worrying. Sarah, quiet and observant, stayed at the back, scanning for anything unusual. The first part of their hike was ordinary. Sunlight dappled the forest floor, birds chirped, and the gentle rustling of leaves accompanied them. But as they ventured deeper, the forest grew strangely quiet. Birds disappeared, the creek's babbling slowed, and even the wind seemed to fade. A sense of oppressive stillness settled over them, making every step feel heavier. By late afternoon, they reached the clearing. It was picturesque, surrounded by steep tree-covered slopes and bordered by the dark, sluggish creek. They set up camp and built a fire. As night fell, the forest's silence became suffocating. Shadows twisted unnaturally, moving independently of the firelight. The friends tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, Ethan wandered toward the tree line to relieve himself. Moments later, Sarah screamed. Ethan was gone. His flashlight lay abandoned, beam trembling on the forest floor. Whispering began, soft at first, then rising, voices calling their names, distorted, almost mocking. Logan tried to peer into the darkness, but the shadows shifted, hiding the source. By morning, Tyler, too, disappeared without a trace while checking the perimeter. Hannah, Sarah, and Logan attempted to retrace their steps, but the forest seemed to resist. Trails looped back on themselves. Familiar landmarks vanished. Even the creek no longer followed the path they remembered. The whispers followed them relentlessly, voices mimicking their own. On the second night, the three remaining friends stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, hidden deep in a valley. Its roof sagged, windows were boarded, and the air inside was thick with decay. The walls were carved with jagged symbols, spirals, and tally marks that seemed to count beyond reason. Bones littered the floor, some old, some fresh. Etched into the walls were words, "The forest never forgets." As night fell, the forest seemed to awaken. Tall, thin figures appeared between the trees, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Faceless shapes pressed against the cabin windows, circling, watching. Whispering voices rose into anguished screams, echoing through the trees. Logan tried to fight them off, but was dragged into the darkness before Hannah and Sarah could intervene. Hannah and Sarah ran blindly through the twisting forest, eventually stumbling back onto the creek. Its water had turned black, sluggish, and shapes moved beneath the surface, limbs unnaturally contorted. Exhausted and terrified, they eventually found a logging road and were rescued by a passing driver. Authorities searched Hemlock Ridge Forest but found no trace of Tyler, Ethan, or Logan. Hannah and Sarah were hospitalized, suffering from trauma and vivid hallucinations. They reported tall, faceless figures, whispering voices, and paths that twisted impossibly. To this day, Hemlock Ridge Forest remains feared. Hikers report shifting trails, whispering voices, and shadows that mimic human movement. Those who enter rarely return unscathed. And deep in the heart of Hemlock Ridge, the forest waits, patient, aware, and hungry, remembering every name, every step, every breath of those who dare to enter. Story the end. The last rays of sun had vanished when Ethan, his younger brother Cole, and their friends, Maya and Sam, arrived at the edge of Whispering Pines, a remote, dense forest in northern Maine. Locals avoided it after dark, speaking of strange disappearances, voices that echoed without source, and shadows that moved with a mind of their own. The group laughed nervously at the warnings, brushing them off as local superstition. They parked on a gravel clearing near a dilapidated trailhead sign. Whispering Pines, do not enter after dusk. Ethan shrugged. It's just a forest. How scary can it be? Cole shivered. It already feels wrong. Maya rolled her eyes. You worry too much. Let's set up camp and enjoy ourselves. The four of them followed the narrow trail into the trees. The forest was dense, the air thick and damp, smelling of wet leaves and something metallic, faint but distinct. Branches snapped behind them from time to time, yet when they turned, nothing was there. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching long and deliberate, almost alive. After an hour, they found a small clearing beside a stagnant pond. They set up tents and started a fire, trying to laugh away the unease. The flickering flames made the trees' long shadows dance grotesquely. Even as they joked, the forest seemed to absorb their voices, growing oppressive. Around midnight, Ethan woke to soft whispering. At first it was indistinguishable from the wind, but slowly the words became clear, names being called in familiar yet wrong tones. Do you hear that? Maya whispered. Sam shined his flashlight around. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his own voice wavered. The whispers grew louder, circling the campsite. Ethan felt unseen eyes on him. Then he saw it, a tall, thin figure between the trees, limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face was hidden by shadow, yet the gaze felt infinite, patient, and hungry. Panic set in. They ran blindly through the forest, tripping over roots and tearing clothes on branches. Every path looped back to the same clearing. The fog thickened, suffocating, clinging to their skin and hair. By the second night, exhaustion and fear had consumed them. The whispers had become coherent sentences. "You cannot leave. Stay with us." Their own voices called back from the fog. They stumbled upon a ruined cabin, its walls blackened and sagging. Bones lay on the floor, arranged in spirals. Scratched into the wall were words, "The forest claims all who enter." Terrified, they fled. Outside, the fog had thickened, and tall, thin, faceless figures emerged. Some wore the faces of people they knew, twisted into lifeless imitations. By the third night, Sam vanished, dragged silently into the fog. Maya disappeared next. Ethan and Cole pressed onward, desperate, slipping through paths that seemed to rearrange themselves with each step. The forest itself felt alive, closing in. In a small clearing, the trees arched unnaturally, forming a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the end. From it, dozens of figures emerged. Some wore the faces of the missing. One stepped forward, Cole's face pale and twisted into a grotesque smile. Ethan grabbed him, but Cole's form dissolved into the fog. He ran blindly, calling his brother's name, but only distorted laughter answered. No one ever saw Ethan, Cole, Maya, or Sam again. Weeks later, hikers found remnants of their campsite. Torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees. Figures too tall, too thin, always watching, always patient. Whispering Pines remained, endless, hungry, and waiting. Those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story the end. The sun had vanished behind the horizon when Logan, his sister Emma, and their friends Tyler and Brooke arrived at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, a remote woodland in northern Michigan. Black Hollow had a reputation. Locals spoke of hikers who never returned, strange lights flickering between the trees, and whispers in the wind that seemed almost sentient. The group laughed off the warnings, eager for a weekend of camping and adventure. They parked on a gravel clearing beside a cracked wooden sign. "Black Hollow, enter at your own risk." Logan shrugged. "It's just a forest. How scary can it be?" Emma shivered. "Something about it feels wrong," Tyler grinned. "Relax. We'll set up camp, make a fire, tell some stories. Easy." The four of them set off down a narrow trail. The trees were tall and thick, blocking the last of the fading sunlight. The air smelled damp, earthy, and metallic, a faint tang that made Logan's stomach churn. Every so often, branches snapped behind them, but whenever they turned, nothing moved. Shadows stretched long and twisted as if alive. After an hour, they stumbled upon a small clearing beside a stagnant creek. They set up tents and a fire, attempting to keep the mood light. The fire's flickering cast strange shapes across the trees. Laughter echoed hollowly, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence of the forest. Around midnight, Logan woke to soft whispering. At first, it seemed like the wind, but soon it formed words, calling names, sometimes familiar, sometimes distorted. "Wrong." "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered. Tyler swung his flashlight around. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The whispers grew louder, circling the campsite. Logan felt eyes upon him. And then he saw it, a figure among the trees, impossibly tall and thin, limbs bending unnaturally. Its face was hidden, but the gaze was patient, hungry, infinite. Panic took over. They ran blindly into the forest, tripping over roots, tearing their clothes on branches. Every path seemed to loop back to the same clearing. Fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, clinging to their skin. By the second night, exhaustion and fear had consumed them. The whispers now formed sentences. "You cannot leave. Stay with us." Their own voices echoed back from the darkness. They stumbled upon a decaying cabin. Inside, bones were arranged in spirals on the floor. Words were carved into the wall. "The forest takes what it desires." Horrified, they fled. Outside, the fog had grown denser. Figures appeared, tall, thin, faceless, some with the twisted faces of people they knew. By the third night, Tyler vanished, dragged silently into the fog. Brooke disappeared next. Logan and Emma pressed onward, desperate, slipping through ever-changing paths. The forest seemed alive, closing in around them. In a small clearing, the trees arched unnaturally, forming a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the far end. From it, dozens of figures emerged, some wearing the faces of the missing. One stepped forward, Emma's face, pale and twisted into a grotesque smile. Logan grabbed her, but she dissolved into the fog. He ran blindly, calling her name, but only distorted laughter answered. No one ever saw Logan, Emma, Tyler, or Brooke again. Weeks later, hikers found remnants of their campsite. Torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees, figures too tall and thin, always watching, always patient. Black Hollow Forest remained, endless, hungry, and waiting. Those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story the end. It started in early November when my friends, Jake, Megan, Tyler, and I decided to go camping in the Alder Creek Forest, a remote stretch of dense timber in Northern California. Locals avoided the area, whispering about people who had vanished there over the decades. We didn't care. We were young, eager for adventure, and we laughed at the warnings. The first day was ordinary. We followed a narrow dirt trail, the air crisp with autumn cold, sunlight flickering through the canopy of fir and cedar. Birds called occasionally, and the smell of wet pine and fallen leaves was strong. We set up camp near a small moss-covered creek, built a fire, and joked late into the evening. By nightfall, something changed. The forest fell silent, not peaceful quiet, but a heavy, suffocating hush. The wind stopped, no rustle of leaves, no distant animal sounds. Even the creek seemed muted. Shadows between the trees grew longer and darker, almost reaching toward our fire. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling our tents. At first, I thought it was a deer or raccoon, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Soft scraping noises like nails dragging over bark moved around us. Jake woke too. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Megan shivered. "It's probably just animals." Tyler didn't answer, his flashlight already shaking in his hand. By morning, footprints appeared in the mud near the creek. Barefoot, human, but elongated, too long for anyone in our group. They led deeper into the forest, twisting and disappearing where no trail existed. Curiosity and fear pushed us forward. We followed the prints, moving through increasingly thick underbrush. Trees crowded together, branches snagging our clothes, roots tripping our feet. Shadows flickered at the edges of our vision. Tall, thin shapes, limbs too long, pale and featureless. Whenever we turned to look directly, they vanished. Hours passed, and the trail seemed to twist upon itself. We became disoriented. The forest didn't feel natural anymore. It was alive, shifting, guiding us further in. By nightfall, Megan disappeared. One moment she was calling out, the next, silence. Panic set in. Tyler and Jake tried to stay calm, but I could see it in their eyes. We were trapped. We stumbled into a small hollow where an abandoned cabin crouched beneath moss and vines. Inside, the walls were etched with stick figures, tall, thin, faceless, with notches marking years or names. One figure was unmistakably Megan, labeled with her initials. The whispers began, soft at first, then louder, circling the cabin. Cold winds swept through, though the trees outside stood still. Shapes moved outside the fog, tall, thin figures with black, reflective eyes and impossibly long limbs gliding silently between the trees. Tyler grabbed my arm, and we ran blindly through the forest. Branches tore at our skin, roots tripped us, and the ground seemed to move underfoot. When we looked back, Jake was gone. By dawn, only Tyler and I made it to the edge of the forest. Rescue teams later found no trace of Jake or Megan. The elongated, barefoot footprints remained near the cabin, leading deeper into the woods, never back out. Locals now avoid Alder Creek. Hikers report whispers calling their names, glimpses of pale, faceless figures standing silently among the trees, and footprints appearing in the mud, leading farther into the forest. Some say the forest collects people, adding them to its collection of shapes that wander barefoot, watching, waiting for the next victims. Years later, I still hear whispers when the wind moves through pines. I sometimes see shadows in the corner of my vision. And I know that Alder Creek Forest remembers me, too. Story the end. It was the summer of 2024 when a group of 6 friends, Evan, Lily, Marcus, Chloe, Ryan, and Sophie, decided to take a weekend camping trip deep in the remote Timberfall Forest of western Pennsylvania. The forest had long been notorious among locals. Whispered stories spoke of hikers vanishing without a trace, eerie lights flickering between the trees at night, and voices calling names that weren't theirs. None of the friends believed the rumors. They were thrill seekers, eager for adventure in the untouched wilderness. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, backpacks loaded, spirits high. Evan, the de facto leader, had studied old maps and planned a route to a clearing near a narrow creek. Lily, cautious and practical, warned about going off trail, but the others teased her for overthinking. Marcus and Ryan encouraged the shortcut, while Chloe and Sophie followed, scanning the forest for anything unusual. The hike started normally. Sunlight filtered through tall oaks and pines, birds chirped, and the breeze rustled the leaves. But the deeper they went, the more unnatural the forest became. Birds and insects vanished. The creek they had been following grew sluggish and almost black. Shadows seemed to shift independently of the light, and an oppressive stillness hung over them, making each step feel heavier. By late afternoon, they reached the clearing. It was eerily beautiful, surrounded by steep hills, moss-covered rocks, and dense trees that seemed to lean inward. They set up camp and built a fire, trying to laugh off the growing unease. As night fell, the forest became unnaturally quiet, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch and writhe. Around midnight, Marcus went to the edge of the clearing to relieve himself. A few minutes later, Lily screamed. Marcus had vanished. His flashlight lay abandoned, beam trembling over the forest floor. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, voices drifted through the trees, calling their names in distorted tones that sounded like their own voices. Evan tried to shine a flashlight toward the noise, but the shadows shifted, hiding the source. By dawn, Ryan disappeared while checking the perimeter. Panic set in. The remaining three, Evan, Lily, and Chloe, tried to retrace their path, but the forest seemed to resist them. Trails looped back on themselves. Landmarks vanished. Even the creek no longer led in the right direction. The whispering followed relentlessly, mocking and relentless. On the second night, the trio stumbled upon an abandoned ranger cabin hidden in a valley. Its roof sagged, windows were boarded, and inside the air was thick with decay. Jagged symbols were carved into the walls, along with tally marks that seemed to count beyond comprehension. Bones littered the floor, some old, some fresh. Etched into the walls were words. They watch. You cannot leave. As night fell, the forest seemed to awaken. Tall, thin figures appeared between the trees, limbs bending at impossible angles, faceless shapes pressed against the cabin windows, circling and watching. The whispering voices rose into anguished screams. Sophie, exhausted and terrified, tried to flee but was dragged silently into the darkness. By morning, only Evan and Lily remained. They ran blindly through the twisting forest, eventually stumbling onto a logging road. Authorities searched Timberfall Forest but found no trace of Marcus, Ryan, Chloe, or Sophie. Evan and Lily were hospitalized, traumatized and haunted by visions of the tall, faceless figures and the endless whispering. To this day, Timberfall Forest remains feared. Trails shift unpredictably, shadows move independently, and whispers call out from the trees. Those who enter rarely return unscathed, and deep in the heart of Timberfall, the forest waits, patient, aware, and hungry, remembering every name, every sound, every step of those who dare to enter. Story the end. It was mid-October when 4 friends, Jake, Rachel, Tom, and Emily, decided to spend a weekend camping in the remote forests outside of Pine Hollow, New Hampshire. The area, known locally as Crofin Woods, was thick with ancient pines and gnarled oaks. Townsfolk whispered about disappearances, strange sightings, and the woods taking people who ventured too deep. But the friends laughed off the warnings. They were young, adventurous, and confident they could handle a night in the forest. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the leaf-strewn trail. The air smelled damp and earthy, the wind eerily still. Birds had gone silent, and even the small woodland animals were absent. The friends chalked it up to the season. They hiked for hours, following a winding trail deeper into the woods. Eventually, they found a small clearing beside a stream and set up camp. The fire crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the trees. But even as they ate and laughed, an uneasy feeling settled over them. Shapes seemed to move at the edge of their vision, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs bent at impossible angles. Each time someone looked directly, the figures vanished. Around 10 p.m., Jake suggested exploring a ridge nearby for a better view of the valley under the moonlight. Emily hesitated, but the group agreed. They grabbed their flashlights and walked into the forest. Immediately, the familiar trail twisted and shifted. Trees seemed to move, blocking paths, while shadows darted between them, always staying just beyond the reach of their lights. Then the whispers began. Soft, distant at first. Jake, Rachel, Tom, Emily. The voices grew louder, circling them, echoing unnaturally through the forest. A low, wet growl rose from the darkness. Figures emerged between the trees, tall, distorted, their faces blank, eyes glowing faint red. The ground beneath them shifted as roots and branches seemed to twist, trying to grab them. They ran, stumbling through underbrush and mud, only to find themselves back at the clearing, as if the forest had folded in on itself. In the center of the clearing, rough wooden effigies lay scattered, each one crudely carved but eerily resembling someone in the group. Jake's stomach sank as he realized one bore his likeness, arms stretched unnaturally, hollow eyes staring. The tallest figure approached, limbs bending unnaturally, eyes glowing red. "Stay! Join us!" The whispers hissed, pressing against their minds. Tom screamed as unseen hands yanked him into the shadows. Emily tried to grab him but was pulled away herself. Rachel ran, Jake chasing, but the forest shifted to trap them, paths folding, roots tangling, branches slamming down. Panic overtook them. By dawn, Jake stumbled out onto a dirt road, exhausted, clothes torn, mud streaked across his face. The forest behind him seemed alive, subtly shifting, the red-eyed figure watching silently from between the trees. Weeks later, Jake received a small wooden effigy in the mail. Arms stretched, hollow eyes, a crude likeness of himself. Attached was a note scrawled in jagged letters. "We are still waiting." Some nights he swears he hears whispers outside his window, soft and patient, calling his name. He knows the forest waits, patient and eternal. It never forgets, it never forgives, and it never lets anyone leave. Story the end. It was the summer of 2022 when a group of 6 friends, Mark, Jenna, Lucas, Sophie, Daniel, and Chloe, decided to camp deep in the Appalachian foothills near a section locals called Shadow Pines. The forest had long carried a reputation for unexplained disappearances and strange sightings. Hikers spoke of hearing whispers at night, of shadows moving independently of any light source, and of lost travelers returning days later with empty, haunted eyes. None of the friends believed in the stories. They were thrill seekers, eager to explore the untouched wilderness. They arrived late Friday afternoon, backpacks heavy with camping gear, food, and supplies. Mark, the leader, insisted they take a shortcut he had found on old topo maps to reach a remote clearing by a small creek. Jenna, cautious and practical, warned that going off-trail in dense forest was risky. Lucas and Sophie, thrill seekers like Mark, encouraged him, teasing Jenna for overthinking. Daniel and Chloe followed, uneasy but trusting the group. At first, the hike seemed ordinary. Sunlight filtered through tall oaks and maples, birds sang, and a gentle breeze rustled leaves. But as they ventured deeper, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Birds and insects vanished, and even the creek's water seemed sluggish, almost black. The air grew colder, heavier, and a sense of oppressive stillness hung over the forest. By late afternoon, they reached the clearing. Moss-covered rocks surrounded the creek, and the trees leaned inward as if to trap them. They set up camp, built a fire, and tried to laugh off the growing unease. But as night fell, the shadows cast by the fire stretched and writhed unnaturally. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt alive, watching them. Around midnight, Lucas went to the edge of the clearing. A few minutes later, Sophie screamed. Lucas was gone. His flashlight lay abandoned, its beam trembling over the ground. Whispers drifted from the trees, soft at first, then rising in intensity. Voices called their names, distorted and warped, echoing from every direction. The remaining friends huddled by the fire, terrified. Shapes began to appear between the trees, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. Their movements were unnatural, bending at impossible angles. Chloe swore she saw one mimic her every gesture, while Daniel felt cold, invisible hands brush his shoulder. By dawn, Mark, Daniel, and Chloe were gone. Jenna and Sophie ran blindly, trying to find their way back to the trailhead. Paths looped back on themselves, familiar landmarks vanished, and the creek shifted, guiding them deeper instead of out. The whispering followed relentlessly, voices imitating their own, calling them to turn back. Eventually, after hours of running, Jenna and Sophie stumbled onto an old abandoned ranger cabin. Its windows were boarded, the roof sagging. Inside, the air was thick with rot. The walls were carved with symbols, twisted spirals and jagged lines that seemed alive. Bones lay scattered across the floor, some old, some fresh. Words were etched into the wood. The forest remembers. You are never alone. Night fell again, and the cabin seemed to come alive. Shadows moved independently, whispering voices rose to screams, and the tall, thin figures pressed against the windows, circling the cabin, watching. Jenna and Sophie stayed awake, terrified, until sunrise. When morning came, they fled blindly, finally reaching a logging road. Authorities searched Shadow Pines but found no trace of Mark, Lucas, Daniel, or Chloe. Jenna and Sophie were hospitalized, suffering from severe trauma, haunted by nightmares of shadows, whispering voices, and impossible forest paths. Locals still warn people away from Shadow Pines. Hikers report moving shadows, whispers calling their names, and trails that shift and loop endlessly. Those who enter rarely return without fear etched into their eyes. And deep in the heart of Shadow Pines, the forest waits, patient, aware, and hungry, remembering every name, every sound, every step of those who dare to enter. Story the end. It was the spring of 2021 when a group of 5 friends from Pennsylvania, David, Claire, Ben, Emily, and Ryan, decided to explore the remote Timber Creek forest. The forest was infamous in local legend. Hikers vanished without a trace. Strange lights flickered between the trees at night, and people claimed they heard whispers calling their names. The friends were thrill seekers, dismissive of superstition, eager to see what lay in the heart of the dense, untouched woods. They arrived late Friday afternoon, backpacks full and spirits high. David, the unofficial leader, had plotted a route using old forest maps to reach a hidden clearing near a small, unnamed creek. Claire, cautious and methodical, worried about getting lost in the dense forest. Ben, impulsive and eager for excitement, teased her about being too careful. Emily, quiet and observant, walked behind the group, scanning for anything unusual. Ryan, easygoing but anxious, followed the others, uneasy but trusting his friends. The first hours of the hike were normal. Sunlight dappled the forest floor, and the sounds of birds and insects filled the air. But by mid-afternoon, the forest changed. The usual wildlife vanished. Even the creek's babbling slowed until it became an almost unnatural stillness. The air grew thick and cold, making their movements sluggish and uneasy. They reached the clearing near the creek and set up camp. The place was eerily beautiful. Moss-covered rocks, steep trees leaning in every direction, and a sense of isolation that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. That night, they built a fire and tried to tell stories to ease the growing tension. Around midnight, David went to check the perimeter of the clearing and never returned. A few minutes later, Emily heard faint footsteps circling the camp, heavy and deliberate. Whispered voices drifted between the trees, calling her name in tones slightly off from her own voice. Ben and Ryan shone flashlights into the darkness, but saw nothing. Claire screamed when a shadow detached itself from the tree line, moving unnaturally, almost floating, and then vanished. Panic consumed them. By morning, David was gone, and the forest seemed to resist their attempts to leave. Trails they had followed looped back on themselves, landmarks shifted, and the creek no longer led toward the path they had taken. Whispering voices followed them relentlessly, mimicking their own words in distorted echoes. By the second night, the remaining 4 stumbled upon an abandoned ranger cabin hidden in a valley. Its windows were boarded, roof sagging, and the air inside thick with rot. The walls were carved with strange, jagged symbols. Bones littered the floor, arranged in patterns that made their stomachs churn. Words were scratched into the walls. They watch. They remember. You cannot leave. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to awaken. Tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and faceless heads appeared between the trees circling the cabin. Whispering voices rose to anguished screams. Emily screamed as one of the figures pressed its featureless face against the window. The others panicked, trying to flee, but the forest itself seemed alive, bending paths and trees to trap them. By dawn, Ben and Ryan were gone, dragged silently into the shadows. Claire and Emily ran blindly, eventually stumbling back to the creek. The water had turned black and sluggish, and shapes moved beneath the surface with impossible, twisted limbs. Exhausted, terrified, they finally stumbled onto a logging road and were rescued by a passing trucker. Authorities searched Timber Creek Forest but found no trace of David, Ben, or Ryan. Claire and Emily were hospitalized, haunted by nightmares and hallucinations of the tall, thin figures and the whispering voices. Locals warned others never to enter that section of forest. To this day, Timber Creek Forest is avoided by hikers. Trails shift, shadows move against the light, and whispering voices echo through the trees. Those who enter rarely return unscathed. And deep within the heart of the forest, something waits, patient and hungry, remembering every name, every sound, every footstep of those who dare to enter. Story the end. It was the end of September when a group of 5 friends from upstate New York, Alex, Jenna, Mark, Sophie, and Ryan, decided to take a weekend camping trip in the remote forests near the Catskills. They had heard vague stories from locals about an area called Thornwood, a dense old forest known for its eerie silence and the occasional unexplained disappearance. Being in their early 20s and thrill seekers at heart, they shrugged off the warnings as exaggerated folklore. They arrived just before sunset and set up camp near a small clearing by a creek. The forest was already shadowed, the tall maples and oaks blotting out the remaining sunlight. At first, everything seemed normal. They joked around the fire, roasted marshmallows, and exchanged ghost stories. But as darkness fell, the air grew colder, heavier, and the forest fell silent. Even the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of nocturnal animals had stopped. Around 9 p.m., Alex suggested a short hike to explore a nearby trail. "We'll be back in an hour," he said, trying to sound casual. Reluctantly, the others agreed, grabbing flashlights and a compass. The trail was overgrown and barely visible. As they walked deeper, the trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled, branches stretching across the path like skeletal arms. The air became damp, smelling of earth and decaying leaves. Soon, the friends realized they had lost the trail entirely. Every direction looked the same, dense trees, undergrowth, and darkness. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, then louder, calling each of their names. "Alex! Alex! Come here! Jenna, don't be afraid!" They froze, glancing at each other in panic. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, sometimes imitating the voices of people they knew. Suddenly, a shape moved in the shadows, tall, thin, limbs bent at impossible angles while face pale and stretched with black, empty eyes. It tilted its head unnaturally, observing them. Sophie screamed as the figure darted between the trees, moving faster than any human could. The friends scattered, running blindly, crashing into branches and tripping over roots. Every path they took seemed to lead them back to the same clearing. The forest was warping, twisting, reshaping itself. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, they couldn't tell. Exhausted, they stumbled upon a decrepit cabin hidden deep among the trees. Its walls were rotted, windows broken, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Desperate, they ran inside and barricaded it with broken boards and debris. The cabin was dark and oppressive. Scratches covered the walls, some fresh, deep, jagged. The air smelled of dampness and decay. Outside, branches tapped against the cabin walls rhythmically, almost like deliberate knocks. The whispers came closer, mocking, echoing their own voices. One by one, the friends were taken. Mark dashed out and never returned. Ryan tried to hold the door shut but was dragged screaming into the darkness. Jenna and Sophie vanished into shadows, leaving Alex alone. Alone, Alex ran through the forest, disoriented and terrified. The trees seemed to close in around him, roots wrapping at his ankles, branches scratching his face. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, always just out of reach. Hours later, he emerged onto an old logging road, alone, exhausted, and bleeding. Authorities found no trace of the others. Alex tried to tell his story, but the locals warned him to never return. They said Thornwood had a way of remembering, of luring people back into its depths. Even years later, Alex hears whispers when the wind blows through trees, sees shadows at the edge of his vision, and sometimes at night, he swears he can hear the voices of his friends calling for him from the forest. Thornwood does not just trap people. It waits, patient, silent, and eternal. It remembers those who wander too deep, and it never lets go. Story the end. It started on a late August morning when a group of 5 friends, Josh, Emily, Rachel, Sam, and me, decided to hike into the Pine Hollow Forest in northern Idaho. The forest had a reputation among locals. Hikers would get lost, hunters sometimes disappeared, and strange, unexplainable things were said to occur in its depths. We didn't care. We were young, confident, and eager for adventure. We set out mid-morning, carrying packs, tents, and enough food for the weekend. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with trees arching overhead, their branches forming a natural canopy that dimmed the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. At first, everything was normal. We laughed, shared snacks, and took photos. But as we went deeper, the forest changed. The air grew heavier, and a silence settled over us. Not the quiet of nature, but something oppressive, almost alive. Birds had vanished, insects disappeared, even the wind seemed to die. Rachel was the first to notice the footprints. Barefoot, human-like, but elongated, with toes far too long. They were fresh, leading off the trail into the dense undergrowth. "Probably a hunter or some camper," Josh said, but his voice lacked conviction. Against our better judgment, curiosity got the better of us, and we followed the prints. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. Trees leaned at impossible angles, roots twisted like serpents, and shadows moved where they shouldn't. Every so often, we thought we saw figures between the trees. Tall, thin, pale, with long limbs and featureless faces. Every time we looked directly, they vanished. By late afternoon, we realized we were lost. The trail had disappeared, replaced by a confusing labyrinth of undergrowth and fog. Our GPS and cell phones didn't work. The forest seemed to block any signal. That night, we tried to set up camp. The darkness was unnatural, pressing down, and the air was icy despite the warm day. Around midnight, whispers began, soft, unintelligible at first, then calling our names. Emily, Josh, Rachel. The voices seemed to move around the camp, circling us. Panic set in. Sam wanted to investigate, but I begged him to stay. Then we heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the underbrush around us. Not animal footsteps, human, but wrong. Suddenly, Rachel screamed. She pointed into the trees. Standing there were three of the figures we had glimpsed earlier. Pale, thin, with eyes black as coal and limbs longer than any human's. They didn't move erratically, they glided. We ran blindly, branches tearing at our clothes, roots tripping us, hearts hammering. The forest seemed to shift around us, landmarks disappeared, and trails twisted into impossibilities. Sam tripped and fell. When we looked back, he was gone. By dawn, only Josh, Emily, and I stumbled out to a small creek. The footprints led straight to the water and then vanished. Exhausted, terrified, and shaken, we realized the others were gone forever. We eventually made it back to the edge of the forest. Search parties never found Sam or Rachel. Locals avoided the deep woods, whispering that the Pine Hollow forest claimed people, adding them to its endless collection of pale, faceless figures that wandered barefoot, watching from between the trees, waiting for the next group to wander too far. Even now, years later, when the wind rustles through pines, I swear I hear whispers, my name, calling me back, and I know the forest still remembers. Story the end. The air was unusually still when Lucas and his friends, Nina, Derek, and Claire, drove down the narrow gravel road that led to Ravenwood Forest. It was late October, and the forest was a mix of skeletal oaks and evergreens, their branches clawing at the fading sunlight. Locals avoided Ravenwood, claiming hikers never returned once they ventured too deep. Lucas, a documentary filmmaker, dismissed the warnings as superstition. He wanted footage of the untouched forest at night. By late afternoon, they parked near a fallen sign half hidden by weeds and started walking along a barely visible trail. The path quickly became narrow, overgrown, and suffocatingly silent. Birds and animals that should have filled the forest were absent. Only the crunch of their boots on leaves broke the eerie quiet. "This feels wrong," Nina muttered, tugging her jacket closer. "Relax," Lucas said. "Perfect lighting for shots, right?" Hours passed, and they reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy, making the forest seem darker than it was. They set up camp, built a small fire, and tried to keep their spirits up. That night, a faint scratching sound came from the trees, followed by a soft, low growl. It circled their camp, close enough that every snap of a twig made their hearts pound. Lucas grabbed his flashlight, sweeping it across the tree line. Shadows moved, but no form was visible. By midnight, the sound had grown closer, sharper, and more deliberate. Suddenly, a scream tore through the air, inhuman, drawn out, echoing. The four froze. Derek whispered, "That's not an animal." Morning brought no relief. The trail back had vanished, replaced by a wall of tangled branches and brambles. Every direction looked identical. Disorientation set in. Hours later, they stumbled upon a decrepit cabin hidden among the trees. Its windows were shattered, the wood blackened and rotted. Inside, the air was thick with mold and decay. The walls were carved with strange symbols, spirals, and angular figures, alongside deep scratches and countless tally marks. On the floor lay bones, small animals mixed with human fragments, some fresh, some long decayed. A shadow moved across the room, tall and thin, limbs unnaturally long. Its face was smooth, featureless, save for a thin slit where a mouth should have been. It tilted its head, watching them. Panic overtook the group. Lucas tried to defend them, swinging a tripod, but it moved impossibly fast, disappearing into the darkness outside. They fled, but the forest seemed alive, roots grabbing at their ankles, branches scratching their faces. Night fell again, and the forest closed in. Whispering voices echoed, mimicking loved ones and friends, confusing and terrifying them. Derek was the first to be taken, dragged into the shadows with a scream that ended abruptly. Hours later, Nina and Claire found themselves near a stone circle, hidden deep in the woods. Bones littered the center, arranged in grotesque patterns. Whispering filled the air, coming from every direction at once. Shadows shifted, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, circling closer and closer. Claire was pulled into the darkness first. Nina ran blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks, but the forest had trapped her. Every path led back to the stone circle. Exhausted, she collapsed, listening to the softened whispers calling her name. Weeks later, search teams scoured Ravenwood Forest. They found traces of camping activity, footprints leading in, but none leading out. No bodies, no survivors. Only the dense forest remained, silently waiting. Locals still warn travelers, the forest is alive, it reshapes paths, and it collects anyone foolish enough to enter. Sometimes at night, those who venture near report whispers, faint screams, and shadows moving against the wind. Ravenwood waits. It always waits. Story the end. It was late October when Ryan, his sister Claire, and their friends Jake and Hannah drove to the outskirts of Dark Hollow Forest, a remote woodland in northern Wisconsin. The locals whispered about the forest, stories of hikers vanishing, strange lights dancing through the trees, and voices calling from the shadows, but the group dismissed it as superstition. They were seeking adventure, a weekend away from the city. They parked at a gravel clearing, the old trailhead sign half rotted and covered in moss. Dark Hollow, keep out after sunset. Ryan shrugged. It's just a forest. How scary can it be? Claire hesitated, looking into the shadows. Something about it feels wrong. Jake laughed. Come on, it's just trees. Let's set up camp and enjoy ourselves. The four of them hiked down the narrow trail. The trees were tall and dense, blocking most of the fading sunlight. The forest smelled of damp leaves and decaying wood. Branches snapped behind them periodically, but every time they turned, there was nothing. Shadows stretched and twisted, appearing alive in the corners of their vision. After a while, they found a small clearing near a stagnant stream and set up camp. Ryan built a fire while the others unpacked. The flames flickered, casting eerie shapes across the trees. Laughter and chatter tried to mask the unease, but the forest seemed to swallow their voices. Around midnight, Hannah awoke to whispering. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but growing louder. The voices called their names, sometimes in familiar tones, sometimes in distorted, unrecognizable echoes. "Do you hear that?" Hannah whispered. Jake shined his flashlight into the darkness. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The whispers continued, moving around the campsite. Ryan felt eyes on him. Then he saw it, a figure among the trees, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the stare was unbearable. Patient, hungry, infinite. Panic seized them. They ran blindly into the forest. Every path led back to the same clearing. Fog crept along the ground, cold and suffocating, clinging to their clothes and skin. By the second night, fear and exhaustion were overwhelming. The whispers had formed sentences. "You cannot leave. Stay with us." Their own voices echoed back from the darkness. They stumbled upon a ruined cabin, blackened and decaying. Bones were arranged in spirals on the floor. Words were carved into the wall. "The forest takes what it wants." They fled. Outside, the fog thickened and tall, thin figures appeared. Some wore the faces of people they knew, twisted and lifeless. By the third night, Jake vanished, dragged silently into the fog. Hannah disappeared soon after. Ryan and Claire pressed on, desperate. slipping through ever-changing paths. The forest seemed alive, reshaping itself to trap them. They reached a clearing where the trees arched unnaturally, forming a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the far end. Dozens of thin figures emerged, some wearing the faces of the missing. One stepped forward, Claire's face pale and twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ryan grabbed her hand, running blindly, but she began to laugh, a high, unnatural sound. She broke free and vanished into the fog. Ryan ran until he could no longer, exhaustion and despair claiming him. No one ever saw Ryan, Claire, Jake, or Hannah again. Weeks later, hikers found remnants of their campsite, torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees, figures too tall and thin, always watching, always patient. Dark hollow forest remained, endless, hungry, and patient. Those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story the end. It was a chilly November afternoon when 4 friends, Ryan, Megan, Kyle, and Tessa, decided to hike in the remote woods outside of Coldwater, Michigan. The forest, known as Blackridge, was dense and old, filled with towering pines and thick underbrush. Locals rarely entered after sunset. Stories circulated about hikers vanishing, reappearing days later in a state of panic, or sometimes never returning at all. The woods were said to have a presence, something that watched and waited. The group was eager for adventure. Ryan, the leader, was fascinated by the forest's reputation, while Megan, cautious but curious, hoped the hike would be exciting. Kyle, skeptical and practical, brushed off the warnings, and Tessa, Ryan's younger cousin, was simply excited to spend time in the outdoors. They started their hike along a narrow trail as the sun began to set, the light fading quickly through the thick canopy. The forest seemed alive, quiet yet unsettling. Birds were silent, the wind barely moved, and the earthy scent of damp leaves clung to everything. At first, the trail was straightforward, and the friends laughed and joked as they walked. By evening, they found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. The fire crackled as they cooked dinner, but the shadows of the surrounding trees stretched unnaturally in the dim light. Megan noticed shapes moving just at the edge of her vision, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs, but each time she looked, nothing was there. Around 11 p.m., Ryan suggested a short exploration hike to a nearby ridge to view the valley under the moonlight. Despite Tessa's protests, the group followed. Almost immediately, the forest seemed to change. Familiar trees disappeared, paths twisted, and branches reached out, snagging their clothing. Shapes flitted in the darkness, tall, distorted silhouettes always just beyond the flashlight beams. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, they grew steadily louder. Ryan, Megan, Kyle, Tessa. The friends froze. Kyle tried to rationalize it, blaming the wind, but the whispers grew more insistent, almost intelligent, guiding them toward an unseen center of the forest. A low, wet growl broke out, surrounding them. From the darkness, a figure appeared, tall, impossibly thin, limbs bent in unnatural angles, and eyes glowing red. It moved silently, and the effigies, rough wooden carvings of human figures scattered along the forest floor, trembled as it passed. Each effigy bore a striking resemblance to the friends themselves. Panic overtook them. They ran blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks. The forest seemed to fold in on itself, paths looping back to the same clearing as if mocking their escape. Tessa screamed as something unseen yanked her backward. Kyle tried to fight but was pulled into the darkness by invisible hands. Megan tripped and fell, disappearing into the fog. Ryan sprinted blindly, adrenaline fueling him, until he burst out onto a small dirt road at dawn, exhausted and mud-streaked. The trailhead was empty. The forest behind him shifted subtly, branches moving like fingers, and he could swear the red-eyed figure was watching, waiting. Weeks later, Ryan received a small wooden effigy in the mail, arms stretched, hollow eyes, a crude likeness of himself. A note scrawled in jagged letters read, "We are still waiting." Some nights he hears soft whispers outside his window, calling his name. He knows the forest waits, patient and eternal. It never forgets, it never forgives, and it never lets anyone leave. Story, the end. It was the first weekend of October when a group of 5 friends, Jake, Amanda, Tyler, Rachel, and Brian, decided to take a camping trip deep into the forests of western Massachusetts. They had heard whispers about an area the locals called Wolf Pine Hollow, a remote stretch of dense woods that nobody ventured into after dark. Rumors of missing hikers, strange lights, and unsettling noises were passed around quietly in town, but the friends, young and eager for adventure, dismissed them as mere superstition. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, filtering golden light through the tall pines. The forest was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects seemed absent. They set up camp in a small clearing near a shallow creek and spent the first hours exploring nearby trails, joking and taking photos. As night fell, the forest grew colder, heavier, and the shadows deepened, unnaturally. Around 10 p.m., Tyler suggested a short hike to explore a trail that led deeper into the woods. "We'll just go a little ways," he said, "and be back in time for camp." Reluctantly, the others agreed, grabbing flashlights and a small compass. The trail quickly became overgrown, twisted, and difficult to follow. Branches clawed at their clothes, roots tripped their feet, and the air grew thick and damp, smelling of decayed leaves. Every step forward seemed to take them farther from familiarity. Then the whispers began, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like wind rustling the leaves. Soon, the voices became clearer, calling their names individually. "Jake, Jake, Amanda, don't be afraid." The friends froze, scanning the darkness around them. Then, between the trees, a figure appeared. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending in unnatural ways, face pale and featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. Its head tilted unnaturally, observing them without sound. Panic set in. Rachel screamed as the figure darted forward, moving faster than humanly possible. They scattered, crashing through dense undergrowth, branches slashing at their faces, roots tangling their feet. Every path seemed to loop back to the same clearing. The forest was shifting, bending, reshaping itself. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the heart of the woods. Its walls were rotting, windows broken, and the door hung crookedly. Desperate, they ran inside and barricaded it with fallen boards and debris. The cabin was suffocating, smelling of damp rot. Scratches and strange symbols covered the walls. Outside, branches tapped and scraped against the structure, a rhythmic, deliberate sound. The whispers grew louder inside, echoing their own voices, mocking them. One by one, the friends were taken. Tyler ran and was dragged screaming into the darkness. Brian vanished while trying to block a door. Amanda and Rachel disappeared in the shadows while huddled together, leaving only Jake alone. Jake ran blindly through the forest, the trees twisting and bending around him. Shadows flickered at the corners of his vision. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the forest itself were breathing down his neck. Hours later, or maybe days, he stumbled onto a logging road, alone, exhausted, and bloodied. Authorities searched for the others, but found no trace. Jake's story was dismissed as delirium, but locals warned him never to return. Even years later, he hears whispers when the wind blows through trees, sees figures moving in the corner of his eyes, and sometimes dreams of being trapped in Wolfpine Hollow again. The forest waits, patient, eternal. It doesn't just trap bodies, it traps minds, and those it claims never truly leave. Story: the end. It began in late September when a group of hikers decided to explore the remote and little-known Hemlock Ridge Forest in Oregon. There were 5 of them: Ryan, Sarah, Matt, Olivia, and me. The forest had a reputation among locals, a place where people got lost, sometimes for days, sometimes forever, but none of us cared. We wanted adventure, untouched trails, and a story to tell. The first day was uneventful. We followed an old logging trail, sunlight breaking through the dense canopy of fir and cedar. Birds chirped occasionally, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. We joked, took pictures, and set up camp near a small creek by late afternoon. As the sun set, the forest changed. The birds went silent. Even the wind seemed to vanish. It was a quiet so complete it felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the dark grew thick even though the moon had risen. Around midnight, I woke to a soft scratching sound outside my tent. At first I thought it was a raccoon or deer, but then I realized it was too deliberate. Slow, scraping noises circling the tent. My heart pounded. I woke Ryan and Matt. We listened. The sound stopped suddenly, then started again, coming from the tree line just beyond the firelight. By morning, we discovered footprints around the campsite. Barefoot, human, but elongated and oddly spaced, like someone, or something, walked on tiptoe for long stretches. The prints led into the deeper forest, and a chill ran down our spines. Against our better judgment, Ryan wanted to follow the tracks. Sarah and Olivia were hesitant, but curiosity pushed us forward. The forest grew thicker, trees crowding together so tightly that sunlight barely touched the ground. Every so often, shadows shifted between the trunks, always out of the corner of our eyes. Hours passed. The trail we thought we were following seemed to vanish. Every tree, every boulder, every stream looked the same. Panic began to settle in. Then came the whispers. Soft, almost like the wind, repeating our names. Ryan, Sarah, Matt, Olivia, Michael. We ran blindly, trying to find our way back to the creek or any familiar landmark. The forest seemed alive, bending paths and hiding landmarks, forcing us deeper into its heart. Branches tore at our clothes and skin. Our breathing was ragged. By nightfall, Olivia disappeared. One moment she was screaming beside me, the next, she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The remaining four of us huddled together, trying to keep sight of each other. At some point, we stumbled into a small clearing where an old, decaying cabin stood, half hidden beneath moss and vines. Inside, the walls were etched with strange figures, tall, thin stick figures with long arms, faceless heads, and small notches along their bodies. One figure was clearly labeled with Olivia's initials. The whispers grew louder inside the cabin, circling us. Shapes began emerging from the fog outside. Tall, pale, humanoid figures with impossibly long limbs, eyes black as coal, and bare feet that made no sound on the forest floor. Panic overtook us. Ryan grabbed my hand, and we ran blindly again. Matt was last to run, and we never saw him again. When morning came, only Ryan and I managed to stumble back to the edge of the forest. Rescue teams later found no trace of Matt or Olivia. The footprints, barefoot, elongated, human-like, remained near the cabin, leading deeper into the forest, never back out. Locals now avoid Hemlock Ridge entirely. Hikers report seeing pale figures between the trees, watching silently. Whispers call their names if they linger too long. And the footprints, they always appear, leading farther into the forest, waiting for the next careless wanderers. I never returned, but years later, sometimes in my dreams, or when the wind rustles through pine, I hear whispers calling my name, and I know the forest still remembers. Story the end. It was late October when a group of 6 friends from Pennsylvania, Logan, Erica, Sean, Tyler, and Rachel, decided to go camping in the remote forests near the Allegheny Mountains. They were drawn to an area locals called Shadowpine Hollow, a stretch of woods so dense and untouched that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Rumors about disappearances and strange happenings had circulated for years, but the friends dismissed them as small-town superstition. They arrived just before sunset and set up camp in a small clearing near a creek. The forest was quiet, eerily so, with only the occasional rustle of leaves. The shadows of the tall pines and oaks stretched across the ground, and the air carried the heavy scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. At first, everything was normal. They roasted marshmallows, told stories, and laughed around the fire. But as darkness fell, the forest seemed to grow heavier, almost alive, pressing in on them. Around 9 p.m., Logan suggested a short hike along a nearby trail. "We'll just go for a bit and be back before midnight," he said. Reluctantly, the others agreed, grabbing flashlights and a small map. The trail was narrow and overgrown. As they walked, the forest seemed to change around them. Trees grew closer, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The path they thought they knew disappeared, replaced by dense undergrowth. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying a subtle, sour smell. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, almost like the wind, but unmistakably calling their names. "Erica, come closer. Sean, don't be afraid." They froze, looking around in panic. The whispers grew louder, repeating in voices that sounded like people they knew or should have known. Suddenly, a figure moved among the trees. It was impossibly tall, thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was pale and featureless, with dark, hollow eye sockets. It tilted its head unnaturally, watching them. Mia screamed as it lunged from the shadows, moving faster than any human could. Panic erupted. The friends scattered, crashing through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks. Every path they tried seemed to loop back to the same clearing, the forest folding in on itself. Hours, or maybe minutes, time seemed meaningless, passed. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled upon a cabin hidden deep in the woods. Its walls were rotting, windows broken, and the door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. Desperate, they rushed inside and tried to barricade the door with debris. The interior was suffocating. Scratches covered the walls, deep and jagged, smelling of old rot. Outside, the sound of branches scratching against the cabin grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. The whispers followed them inside, echoing their names, mocking their fear. One by one, the friends were taken. Tyler ran and disappeared into the darkness. Sean tried to hold a door shut, but unseen hands dragged him away. Rachel and Mia vanished while huddled together, leaving Logan and Erica alone. They ran blindly through the forest, the trees bending inward, roots tangling their feet, branches clawing at their faces. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, always just out of reach. By dawn, only Logan emerged from Shadowpine Hollow, collapsing onto an old logging road, alone and bleeding. Authorities found no trace of the others. Logan's story was dismissed as hysteria, but locals warned him never to return. He left Pennsylvania and never looked back, though even years later he hears whispers when the wind blows through trees, sees shadows at the corner of his eyes, and sometimes dreams of the forest swallowing him again. Shadowpine Hollow does not just trap the body. It waits, patient, eternal, claiming anyone who wanders too deep. Those it takes never truly leave. They wait, hidden in the darkness, whispering, always calling for the living. Story the end. The mist hung thick over Hollow Pine Forest as Ethan parked his truck at the edge of the gravel path. The forest was infamous in the small Appalachian town of Brimley. Locals said it wasn't just trees and wildlife, that the forest itself was alive and predatory. Hikers, hunters, and campers had vanished over the years, and none were ever found. Ethan wasn't alone. Along with him were his sister Claire, his friend Marcus, and Marcus's girlfriend, Lily. They had packed lightly, intending only an overnight camping trip. The thrill of exploring an untouched, infamous forest was enough to mask their unease. The first hour on the trail was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of decayed leaves and moss. Branches scraped against their jackets, and every rustle in the underbrush made them jump. "This feels wrong," Lily said, hugging Marcus's arm. Ethan laughed nervously. "Relax, it's just the forest being, well, a forest." By late afternoon, they came upon a small clearing beside a creek. The water was murky, and the ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches. They set up a modest camp, lit a fire, and tried to shake off the creeping anxiety. Night came quickly, and with it the first sounds, twigs snapping, faint scraping, and a low, guttural growl that seemed to circle their campsite. The friends froze. Ethan shined his flashlight, cutting through the darkness, but revealed only trees swaying gently in the wind. Hours passed. The fire dimmed, and the sounds drew closer, sharper, more deliberate. A scream broke the night, a long, distorted, inhuman sound. Marcus cursed under his breath, gripping a stick like a weapon. The others huddled close, praying it was just an animal. Morning brought no relief. When they attempted to leave, the trail they had followed was gone. The forest had shifted, paths twisting back on themselves, landmarks disappearing. Panic set in. They wandered for hours, eventually discovering a decaying cabin hidden deep in the trees. Its windows were shattered, the wood blackened with age, and the air inside was thick with mold. Strange symbols covered the walls, angular, repetitive, and interspersed with deep tally marks. In one corner lay a pile of bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. From the shadows, movement caught their eyes. A figure emerged, tall, gaunt, with impossibly long limbs ending in black claws. Its face was smooth and pale, featureless except for a thin slit where a mouth should have been. It tilted its head, studying them with unnatural patience. Panic overtook them. Ethan swung a tripod, but the figure moved faster than any human could perceive, vanishing into the darkness outside. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, but the forest itself seemed to shift, roots twisting and branches blocking escape. Night fell again. Whispering voices echoed, imitating their friends and family, taunting them. Lily was pulled into the shadows first, her screams abruptly ending. Marcus tried to fight back, but vanished moments later. Ethan and Claire fled blindly, stumbling over roots and mud, only to find themselves at a stone circle littered with bones, some fresh, some decayed. Claire was the next to disappear, leaving Ethan alone. Exhausted, terrified, he wandered until he collapsed near a creek, hearing the whispers call his name from every direction. He realized with horror that the forest had no exit. that it was alive and patient, and that it would not release him. Weeks later, search parties scoured Hollow Pine Forest. They found signs of camping activity and footprints leading into the woods, but none coming out. The forest remained silent, endless, and impenetrable. Locals still warn outsiders. The forest collects the lost, reshapes paths, and watches patiently. Sometimes, if you walk too close at night, you can hear whispers calling your name or a faint scraping in the darkness. Those who hear it rarely return. Hollow Pine waits. It always waits. Story the end. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when Logan, his girlfriend Claire, and their friends, Derek and Mia, arrived at the edge of Raven Creek Forest, a remote woodland in northern Michigan. The forest was thick, with trees so dense that sunlight barely touched the forest floor even in the afternoon. Locals whispered about disappearances and strange lights, but the group dismissed the warnings. They were here for a weekend camping trip, excited by the thrill of isolation. They parked near an overgrown trailhead, the wooden sign half rotted and covered in moss. Raven Creek, private property. Derek laughed. "Look at that, private property. Bet nobody's been here in years." Claire hesitated. "It feels wrong, too quiet." "Stop worrying," Logan said. "It's just a forest. Come on." They set off along the narrow trail, flashlights cutting arcs through the darkness. The air smelled damp, earthy, with a faint metallic tang. Branches snapped behind them from time to time, though nothing was visible. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting in ways that made them look alive. After an hour, they found a small clearing beside a creek. They set up camp and built a fire. The light danced across the trees, casting grotesque shadows. They tried to laugh, but the forest seemed to swallow their voices, making the night feel oppressive. Around midnight, Logan awoke to whispers. Soft, overlapping, indistinct, yet unmistakably human. They called names, sometimes their own, sometimes voices that mimicked them. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered. Derek shone his flashlight into the dark. "Probably an animal. Relax." But the whispers continued, moving through the forest, circling the campsite. Logan felt eyes on him, and then he saw it, a figure between the trees, impossibly tall and thin, limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face was hidden by shadows, but the stare was palpable, patient, hungry, infinite. Panic set in. They ran blindly into the forest. Every path led back to the same clearing. The fog crept in, thick and suffocating, clinging to their clothes and skin. By the second night, exhaustion and fear had set in. The whispers had formed sentences. "You cannot leave. Stay with us." Even their own voices echoed back from the fog. They stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, half collapsed and rotten. Inside, bones were arranged in spirals on the floor. Words were scratched into the walls. "The forest wants you." Terrified, they fled. Outside, the fog was thicker. Figures emerged, tall, thin, faceless, moving slowly but deliberately. Some wore the faces of people they knew, twisted, lifeless imitations. By the third night, Derek disappeared, dragged silently into the fog. Mia followed soon after, vanishing without a sound. Logan and Claire pressed on, desperate, slipping through ever-changing paths. The trees seemed alive, reshaping themselves to trap them. They reached a clearing where the trees arched into a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the far end. From it, dozens of thin figures emerged, some wearing the faces of the missing. One stepped forward. Claire's face, pale and twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Logan grabbed her hand and ran blindly, but she began to laugh, a high, unnatural sound. She broke free and vanished into the fog. Logan ran until he could no longer until exhaustion and despair claimed him. No one ever saw Logan, Claire, Derek, or Mia again. Weeks later, hikers found remnants of their campsite, torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees, figures too tall and thin, always watching, always patient. Raven Creek Forest remained endless, hungry, and patient, and those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story, the end. The sun was already sinking behind the hills when Tyler, Mia, Alex, and Jenna reached the edge of Blackwood Forest. The town they had just passed through warned travelers to stay away after dark. Blackwood was thick, ancient, and whispered about in fearful tones. Locals claimed people who wandered too far never returned, and those who did came back changed. Tyler, an amateur filmmaker, wanted to capture authentic forest horror, and his friends had agreed, more for the thrill than belief in the warnings. They parked at the side of the dirt road and stepped onto a narrow trail shrouded in shadows and fog. The first mile was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustle of small animals, only the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Tyler held the flashlight, but its beam seemed to barely penetrate the gloom. "This place is creepy," Jenna whispered. "It's perfect," Tyler said, trying to sound confident. "Great footage. Nothing to worry about." By late afternoon, they found a small clearing with a stream cutting through it. They set up camp and built a fire. The forest seemed to lean in, as if listening. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air grew heavy with the smell of wet leaves and soil. As night fell, faint scratching noises began around the clearing. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, but no animal appeared. Then came the whispers, soft at first, almost unintelligible, then clearer, calling their names in distorted voices. Tyler shined the flashlight toward the sound, catching movement among the trees. A shadow flickered. Tall, unnaturally thin, limbs moving in impossible angles. Its face was smooth, featureless, save for a dark slit where a mouth should have been. It tilted its head, observing them silently. Panic overtook the group. They scrambled to the tent, trying to pack up, but the forest seemed alive. The path they had taken to get there had vanished, replaced by thick undergrowth that twisted and blocked their way. Every direction looked identical. Hours passed. The whispers grew louder, voices mimicking loved ones, calling them deeper into the forest. Jenna was the first to be taken. Tyler turned to see her dragged into the shadows, screaming, and then silence. Mia and Alex ran blindly, their flashlights flickering. The creature followed silently, circling them. Alex tripped and fell. Tyler tried to pull him up, but both were suddenly yanked into darkness. Only faint screams lingered, echoing through the dense forest. By morning, search parties found nothing. No footprints, no camp, no evidence that the friends had ever been there. Only the dense, unending trees of Blackwood. Over the years, others reported seeing lights flicker through the forest at night, hearing whispers calling their names, or glimpsing tall, thin shadows moving faster than any human could run. Blackwood Forest waits. It always waits. Story the end. It was the weekend before Halloween when a group of 5 friends decided to go camping in the remote forests near Harper's Hollow, Maine. The forest was dense and ancient, filled with towering pines and thick undergrowth. Locals avoided it, warning that the woods remembered anyone who wandered too far, that travelers often vanished or returned forever changed. But the friends, Ethan, Lily, Marcus, Jenna, and David, were thrill seekers, dismissing the stories as superstition. They arrived in the late afternoon, backpacks loaded, flashlights ready. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally through the trees. The air was crisp, smelling of wet leaves and moss. At first, the hike was peaceful. Birds called, leaves crunched underfoot, and the friends laughed as they explored the winding trails. By evening, they found a small clearing near a stream and set up camp. The fire crackled, illuminating the dark tree line, but the shadows seemed to stretch farther than natural. Lily noticed shapes at the edges of her vision, tall, thin, with limbs bent at impossible angles, but when she blinked, they were gone. Around 11 p.m., Ethan suggested a short trek to a nearby ridge for the view of the valley under the moonlight. Despite Jenna's protests, they grabbed their flashlights and ventured into the darkness. Almost immediately, the forest began to change. Familiar landmarks disappeared, trails twisted, and branches snagged at their clothing. The shadows moved with a deliberate, intelligent awareness, always staying just out of reach. Then came the whispers, faint at first but growing louder. Ethan, Lily, Marcus, Jenna, David. The friends froze. David laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the voices were insistent, surrounding them, coming from all directions. A low, wet growl sounded from the darkness. Shapes emerged between the trees, tall, distorted figures, limbs unnaturally long, faces blank or twisted. The ground seemed to shift underfoot, roots wrapping around their ankles, pulling them toward a central clearing. There, rough wooden effigies were scattered, crude carvings of people, each eerily resembling someone in the group. The tallest figure moved forward, impossibly thin, eyes glowing red. The effigies trembled as it approached. "Stay! Join us!" the whispers echoed, hypnotic and insistent. Panic erupted. Marcus screamed as invisible hands yanked him into the darkness. Lily tried to grab him but was pulled away herself. Jenna ran, Ethan chasing, but the forest twisted to trap her, paths folding, trees moving to block escape. He fought desperately, finally breaking free and stumbling out onto a dirt road at dawn, exhausted, mud-streaked, and terrified. The trailhead was empty, the forest behind him shifting subtly, like it was alive and aware. Weeks later, Ethan received a small wooden effigy in the mail, arms stretched, hollow eyes carved crudely to resemble himself. A note accompanied it, jaggedly written, "We are still waiting." Some nights he hears whispers outside his window, soft, patient, calling his name. He knows the forest waits, eternal and relentless. It never forgets, never forgives, and it never lets anyone leave. Story. The end. The late afternoon sun was fading when Ethan, his childhood friends Sarah, and two others, Mason and Lily, arrived at the edge of Hollow Pines, a dense, isolated forest in upstate New York. Hollow Pines had a reputation among locals, strange disappearances, eerie lights, and whispers in the dark, but the group dismissed it as superstition. They were here for a weekend camping trip, seeking adventure and escape from the city. They parked on a gravel clearing near an old trailhead marked with a weathered wooden sign, "Hollow Pines, enter at your own risk." Ethan shrugged. "It's just a forest. How scary can it be?" Sarah hesitated, peering into the darkening trees. "I don't know. It already feels wrong." Mason laughed. "Come on, it's just trees. We'll set up camp, have a fire, tell a few stories. Easy." They set off along the trail, flashlights cutting swaths through the thickening shadows. The air smelled damp, earthy, and metallic, as if the forest itself was bleeding. Branches snapped behind them from time to time, though they saw nothing when they turned. Shadows seemed unnaturally long and purposeful, stretching just beyond the light. After an hour, they came to a small clearing with a stagnant pond reflecting the pale moonlight. They set up tents and built a small fire, trying to maintain normalcy. But as darkness fell, the forest seemed to grow silent, oppressive as if holding its breath. Then came the whispers, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but growing louder. They called names, sometimes in familiar voices, sometimes in distorted echoes of the group's own words. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her jacket. Mason tried to shine his flashlight around. "It's just the wind. Trees make noise." But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to move, circling them, teasing, probing. Ethan felt eyes on him, even though there was no one there. And then he saw it. A figure between the trees, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden by shadow, but its gaze felt infinite, patient, and hungry. Panic set in. They ran blindly into the forest, stumbling over roots and tearing their clothes on branches. Every path led back to the same clearing. The fog thickened, clinging to the ground, suffocating them. By the second night, exhaustion, hunger, and fear had worn them down. The whispers had grown into voices, forming sentences. "You cannot leave. Stay with us." Even their own voices were mimicked, calling out from the darkness. They stumbled upon a ruined cabin, half collapsed and blackened with age. Inside, the floor was littered with debris and old bones arranged in careful spirals. Carved into the wall were words, "The forest takes what it wants." Terrified, they fled. Outside, the fog had grown heavier, and the tall, thin figures appeared, countless, silent, faceless. They did not move quickly. They simply advanced with deliberate, unrelenting patience. By the third night, Mason had vanished, dragged silently into the fog while Ethan and Sarah slept. Lily followed soon after, disappearing without a sound. Ethan and Sarah pressed on, desperate, slipping through the ever-changing paths. The trees seemed alive, reshaping themselves to trap them. In a small clearing, the trees arched unnaturally, forming a tunnel. Pale, sickly light flickered at the far end. From it, dozens of the thin figures emerged. Some wore the faces of the missing friends, twisted and lifeless. One stepped forward, its face Sarah's, pale and stretched into a grotesque smile. Ethan grabbed her hand, fleeing blindly, but she began to laugh. A high, unnatural sound that pierced the forest. She broke free and vanished into the fog. Ethan ran until his lungs burned, until exhaustion stole his strength. No one ever saw Ethan or Sarah again. Weeks later, hikers found remnants of their campsite, torn tents, scattered gear. Cameras recovered showed only faint silhouettes among the trees, figures too tall, too thin, always watching, always waiting. Hollow Pines remained endless, patient, and hungry. And those who wandered too far were never seen again. Story the end. It was the fall of 2020 when a group of 4 college friends, Alex, Jenna, Marcus, and Sophie, decided to escape the city for a weekend camping trip in the remote Green Hollow Forest in western Pennsylvania. The forest had always carried a reputation among locals. Stories of hikers disappearing, strange lights flickering between the trees at night, and whispers that seemed to call out names in distorted tones made Green Hollow a place people avoided after dark. But the group, young and confident, were thrill seekers, eager for adventure and dismissive of local superstition. They arrived late Friday afternoon carrying tents, backpacks, and food. The sun was low, golden in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense forest floor. Alex, the de facto leader, had studied old topographical maps and marked a trail leading to a clearing near a small creek that locals avoided. Jenna, always cautious, worried about the forest's dense canopy that blocked GPS signals. Marcus, impulsive and energetic, teased her, calling her paranoia a classic horror movie reaction. Sophie, quiet and observant, trailed slightly behind, noting the unusual silence that seemed to settle over the forest as they hiked deeper. At first, the hike was uneventful. The forest was beautiful, with tall oaks and maples whose leaves had just begun to turn. But by mid-afternoon, they noticed something strange. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling wildlife, were gone. Even the creek they followed grew strangely silent, as though the water had ceased to move. They reached their clearing by late afternoon. It was picturesque, surrounded by steep tree-lined slopes and bordered by the creek. They set up tents and built a small fire. That night, the wind carried a subtle metallic smell, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed unnaturally long, twisting like living things. Around midnight, Marcus, who had gone to relieve himself at the edge of the clearing, screamed. Jenna and Sophie ran toward the sound, flashlights cutting through the darkness, only to find him gone. His backpack lay on the ground, zipper half open, and the firelight revealed strange symbols scratched into the trees nearby, jagged, unfamiliar markings that seemed almost alive. Alex, trying to maintain calm, insisted it was a prank or an animal, but Jenna's unease was growing. They spent the rest of the night huddled near the fire, hearing whispering voices drifting through the trees, soft at first, then growing louder. The whispers seemed to mimic their own voices, calling their names in distorted tones, twisting familiar words into something alien and threatening. No matter where they shined their flashlights, the source remained unseen. By morning, the group realized they were disoriented. Trails they had marked were gone, landmarks vanished, and the creek they had relied on had shifted its course. Panic set in. Alex tried to lead them back to the main trail, but the forest seemed to resist, paths looping back upon themselves as though the trees themselves were alive, guiding them deeper into the wilderness. That afternoon, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, hidden in a depression surrounded by thick underbrush. Its roof sagged, windows boarded, and the door hung slightly open. Inside, the air was thick with decay and rot. Symbols covered the walls, some carved deep into the wood, others scratched roughly. Bones lay scattered across the floor, animal and some unidentifiable, arranged in patterns that made their skin crawl. Among the carvings they found words. The forest remembers. The forest waits. As night fell again, the cabin seemed to transform. Shadows moved independently of the firelight. Whispering voices rose into anguished screams. Shapes emerged between the trees outside, tall, thin figures with unnaturally long limbs, faceless or with distorted features, circling the cabin. Sophie screamed when one pressed its featureless face against the window. Alex tried to reason, but fear had replaced logic. By dawn, Marcus was never found, dragged silently into the darkness while the others slept fitfully. The remaining three attempted to flee. Paths twisted and looped, the forest refused to release them. Eventually, Jenna and Sophie reached the creek again, but it was no longer the familiar landmark. The water was black, sluggish, and shapes seemed to move beneath the surface, limbs bending unnaturally. Exhausted and terrified, they eventually stumbled onto a logging road and were found by a passing trucker. Authorities searched the forest but found no trace of Alex or Marcus. Jenna and Sophie were hospitalized for trauma, reporting hallucinations, shadowy figures, and whispering voices that persisted even after leaving the forest. Locals say that Green Hollow Forest remains alive, patient, and hungry. Hikers report strange whispers, shadows that mimic human movement, and trails that shift inexplicably. Those who enter are never the same, if they return at all, And somewhere deep in the heart of Green Hollow, the forest waits, watching, remembering every name, every sound, every breath of those who dare to enter. Story the end. It was early November when a group of friends from Ohio, Ethan, Claire, Marcus, Lily, and Sam, decided to take a weekend camping trip in the forests of northern New Hampshire. They had heard rumors from locals about a remote area called Ravenwood Hollow, a stretch of forest so dense and old that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. Stories of hikers disappearing had circulated for decades, but the friends dismissed them as exaggerations meant to scare tourists. They arrived in the afternoon, parking near a barely visible trailhead. The forest loomed ahead, dark and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant cawing of crows. They set up camp near a clearing, a small creek nearby providing water, and spent the first few hours exploring the edges of the woods. As evening fell, the air cooled sharply, and the forest seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. Even the wind had stopped. Sam suggested a short hike to see the deeper parts of the forest before darkness set in. Reluctantly, the others agreed, bringing flashlights and a map Ethan had printed from an old hiking site. At first, the hike seemed uneventful. The forest was dense, the air thick with damp pine and decaying leaves, but soon the trail became difficult to follow. Branches blocked their path, roots tangled beneath their feet, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It started with whispers. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Then the voices became clearer, calling their names in soft, familiar tones. Ethan? Ethan? Come. Claire? Over here. They froze, trying to convince themselves it was their imagination. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, echoing between the trees. Suddenly a shadow moved between the trunks, a figure impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bending unnaturally, face obscured by long, dark hair and pale, stretched skin. It tilted its head in an unnatural way, observing them without sound. Panic set in. Lily screamed as the figure lunged forward and disappeared into the trees. The group ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth and tripping over roots. Every path they took seemed to loop back to the same clearing. The forest was shifting, reshaping itself, trapping them deeper and deeper. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had no meaning in Ravenwood Hollow. Exhausted, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, rotting and overgrown with moss. Desperate, they ran inside and tried to barricade the door. The interior was oppressive. Scratched symbols covered the walls, deep gouges etched into the wood. The air was heavy, foul, smelling of damp earth and decay. The creature, or many of them, began tapping and scratching on the walls, a rhythm that made their skin crawl. Whispers filled the room, mimicking their voices, mocking their fear. One by one, the friends were taken. Marcus ran and was dragged screaming into the darkness. Sam vanished while trying to hold a door closed. Claire and Lily were pulled into the shadows, their screams swallowed by the forest. Only Ethan remained. He stumbled blindly through the trees, the forest warping around him. Roots tangled his feet, branches clawed at his face, and shadows twisted into shapes that whispered his name. Hours later, he emerged onto an old logging road, alone, exhausted, and bleeding. The forest behind him was silent, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. Authorities found no trace of the missing friends, no footprints, no evidence they had ever been there. Ethan tried to tell his story, but no one believed him. Locals warned him never to return, explaining that Ravenwood Hollow never let anyone leave untouched. Even years later, Ethan hears whispers when the wind blows through pine trees, sees shadows moving at the edge of his vision. He knows that the forest remembers, that it waits, patient and eternal, ready to reclaim anyone who dares to wander too far. The thing about Ravenwood Hollow is simple. It doesn't just trap bodies, it traps minds, and sometimes it calls them back, whispering in familiar voices, luring the living into the darkness, just as it did to his friends. Story, the end. It was late September when 4 friends decided to explore the remote forests outside of Brimfield, Massachusetts. The forest was known locally as Ash Hollow, a dense, twisted woodland with ancient pines and moss-covered oaks. Rumors of disappearances had circulated for decades. Hikers, hunters, even campers were said to vanish, sometimes for hours, sometimes forever. The locals spoke of the Watchers, strange figures glimpsed at the edges of sight, always observing, always patient. The group consisted of Alex, an adventurous leader, his girlfriend, Marissa, cautious but curious, his best friend, Daniel, practical and skeptical, and Rachel, Alex's younger sister, eager to prove herself. They arrived just before dusk, backpacks ready, joking about the ghost stories, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping over them. At first, the forest seemed welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the branches, highlighting the reds and golds of fall leaves. Birds called, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. They hiked a well-worn trail deeper into Ash Hollow, laughing, taking photos, and sharing stories. By evening, they set up camp in a small clearing near a creek. The fire crackled and popped, sending long shadows stretching between the trees. As darkness fell, the forest grew still, too still. Every sound, every rustle, every whisper of wind felt amplified. Marissa noticed shapes moving in the shadows, tall and thin, always just beyond the light. Around 11 p.m., Alex suggested a short hike to a nearby ridge for the view of the valley below. Despite Marissa's protests, they grabbed flashlights and set off. Almost immediately, the forest changed. Trails twisted unnaturally. Familiar trees shifted positions. Shadows lurked at the edge of their vision. Figures with impossibly long limbs, faces featureless or distorted, disappearing whenever they looked directly. Then the whispers began, faint, almost melodic, calling their names. Alex, Marissa, Daniel, Rachel. The friends froze, hearts pounding. Daniel tried to rationalize it. It's just the wind or animals, but his voice was shaky. A low, wet growl echoed from all around. Shapes began to move between the trees, circling, patient and deliberate. The friends ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches slapping their faces. The clearing they thought they had left was gone. Every path led them back to the same spot. Eventually, they stumbled into a circle of rough wooden effigies, each carved crudely but recognizable, one for each of them. Alex's stomach sank as he realized one even resembled himself, arms outstretched, hollow eyes staring. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall, unnaturally thin, limbs bent at impossible angles, its face featureless except for glowing red eyes. The effigies trembled as it approached. "Stay. Join us," the whispers pleaded, echoing in their minds. Daniel screamed as invisible hands grabbed him, pulling him toward the red-eyed figure. Marissa tried to fight, but something coiled around her legs, dragging her down. Rachel ran blindly, Alex chasing, but the forest seemed alive, shifting to trap them. Paths disappeared, trees moved, roots and vines twisted like snakes to block escape. Hours or minutes passed. Exhaustion set in. Alex finally broke free, dragging Rachel toward what he hoped was the trailhead. They stumbled into a small clearing at dawn, mud-streaked, clothes torn. The forest behind them seemed to shimmer, shifting in impossible ways. The red-eyed figure watched from the tree line, unmoving, patient. They returned to town shaken, refusing to speak of what had happened. Weeks later, Alex received a small wooden effigy in the mail. Arms stretched, hollow eyes, a crude likeness of himself. Attached was a note in jagged handwriting, "We are still waiting." Some nights, Alex swears he hears whispers outside his window, soft and patient, calling his name. Deep down, he knows the forest never forgets, never forgives, and it never lets anyone leave. Story the end. It began in early October when a group of friends, Tyler, Dana, Chris, and me, decided to hike the abandoned Bramblewood Trail in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. We were recent college grads, restless and chasing one last thrill before winter. The Bramblewood area had a reputation. Old logging roads, forgotten cabins, and locals whispering about people who'd vanished over the decades. Most dismissed it as superstition, but that made it more enticing. We arrived mid-afternoon, the sun low, orange through the canopy. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with moss covering tree trunks and fallen logs. The air smelled of wet pine and rot. At first we laughed, joking about haunted forests and ghost stories, but by the time we'd gone a mile in, the jokes died down. Something felt off. It started with the quiet. Not the peaceful forest kind, but a heavy, unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, not even the wind stirred the trees. Then came the first glimpse. Something moving just beyond the trees. Tall, thin, and pale, its limbs oddly long, disappearing whenever we looked directly at it. "Probably a deer," Chris said, though his voice wavered. We pressed on, following the trail as it wound deeper into the forest. Hours passed, and the light faded faster than it should have. The forest seemed to shift around us. Landmarks we thought we recognized twisted into impossible formations. We stopped to rest near a small creek and noticed footprints in the mud, Barefoot, human, but too long, too narrow, like the shape of a hand stretched into a foot. Dana shivered. We shouldn't be here. We laughed nervously and decided to turn back. That's when the whispers started, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Names, our names, spoken in voices that didn't belong to anyone alive. Tyler, Dana, Chris, Michael. Panic set in. We ran, but the trail vanished. The trees grew closer, the fog rolling in thick, disorienting us. Branches scratched our faces, roots tangled our feet, and every sound echoed in a way that didn't feel natural. By nightfall, Chris disappeared. One moment he was next to me, the next, gone. We called his name, but the forest responded only with the rustle of leaves and distant whispers. We stumbled into a clearing where an old cabin sat, hidden beneath vines and moss. Its walls were covered in carvings, tall stick figures with elongated limbs, faceless heads, and small notches marking years or names. One figure was unmistakably Chris, labeled with his initials. The whispers intensified, moving inside the cabin and circling us. A cold wind swept through, though the trees outside were still. Shapes emerged from the fog. Pale, thin figures, eyes black and reflective, standing motionless. Their limbs were impossibly long, moving with eerie grace, surrounding us without a sound. Tyler grabbed Dana and ran, but I froze, paralyzed by the sight. One figure stepped closer. Its face was blank, yet I felt it staring into me, into my very thoughts. The last thing I remember is a cold hand touching my shoulder. I woke alone the next morning at the edge of the forest. The trail behind me was gone. Tyler and Dana were never found, and search parties found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle. Only the hollow echo of the forest remained. Locals now avoid Bramblewood Trail entirely. Hikers' stories of whispers calling their names, shadows standing between the trees, and footprints appearing in the mud leading deeper into the forest. Never out. Some say the forest collects people, adding them to the endless procession of pale, faceless figures that wander barefoot, waiting for the next visitors. I never returned. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the pines near my home, I hear soft whispers. I see shadows in the corner of my vision, and I know the Bramblewood Forest still remembers me. Story the end.